Hey everyone, and welcome back to Timeless. Today we are going to be doing our sideboarding deep dive where I am going to help you build a sideboard. If you are new to Timeless, I would recommend watching my recent tutorial on how to understand matchups. I'll have a link to that. It's less than 15 minutes and it will get you an idea of how to build a sideboard. In this video, we're going to go over the specifics of what cards you're going to include in your sideboard and why in the context of the current Timeless meta. I'm planning on covering over 150 different cards in this video. I have a giant spreadsheet. So I'm going to split it up into 6 chunks of different cards you want to sideboard in different situations. We're going to first talk about sideboard options against fair decks, then sideboard options against unfair decks, sideboard options against control, against graveyard decks, against artifacts and enchantments, and then lastly, some specific hate pieces and hosers for very specific decks. Up first, we're going to talk about all of the cards against fair decks and creature decks, and for simplicity, we're going to go ahead and tier list them. So, up first, I have two really interesting cards to discuss together. Interesting because one of these cards I'm going to put in A tier, and one of them is going to go all the way down in D tier. So, before I start yapping, can you, the viewer, think of which one is going to go in which tier? All right, and keep in mind, we're talking about these as sideboard cards in the context of the current timeless meta, which could, of course, change over time. So first, let's talk about Fury, which I am very high on, and I'm going to rate an A tier. And the reason I'm going to rate it an A tier is because it gets rid of its own downside. The quote-unquote downside of casting Fury for 0 mana is that it costs you card advantage. You have to exile a red card from your hand, meaning that your 0 mana removal spell costs you 2 cards, putting you down on cards, right? However, this is generally used to clean up multiple creatures, which helps mitigate the downside of it. It can also be used as early as needed, so if your opponent has a Ragavan nut draw and you really need to get that Ragavan out of the way, you can do so. A common play pattern is something like your opponent plays a Ragavan turn 1, and after that they follow it up with a Guide of Souls and another threat. You untap on your turn 2, you want to hold up your 2 mana for mana drain, or to play your own 2 mana threat. You don't want to spend mana cleaning up the board, so what you do is you evoke the Fury for 0 mana. It doesn't use your mana, so that you still have your 2 mana free to either hold up interaction or advance your own game plan, and you clean up your opponent's early advantage. And it's never a 2-for-1 against your favor in situations like that. It's usually a 2-for-2, sometimes a 2-for-3, sometimes it's like a 2-for-a 1.5 where you like kill a token in a creature. But Fury, when cast on turn 2 or turn 1, is usually not card disadvantage, and it just punches right into your opponent's tempo. What the aggro decks in the format right now are trying to do is trying to take advantage of tempo with cards like Ragavan, cards like Guide of Souls, really aggressive one-drops like Nethergoy, for cards like Psychic Frog that can attack you for card advantage. And this card just completely slows down those decks for 0 mana as early as you could possibly need it. Solitude, unfortunately, is going to D tier, and at first you might think, well, these two cards are doing the same thing, right? It's a 0 mana removal spell. Well, there's a main difference that Solitude is only ever a 1-for-1 removal spell, and when you're evoking a card for your hand, it's a 2-for-1 against your favor. Now keep in mind, we're talking about Solitude in a vacuum as a sideboard card. We're not ephemerating it here. We're just saying, would you sideboard in Solitude to help kill creatures in creature decks? And in the current timeless meta, the answer is no. However, there are metas where Solitude is a very good sideboard card. For example, imagine a Malia combo. That is a 2-card creature combo. You need the Malia and the Wild Growth Walker in play, and then once you gain life, it's an infinite loop. Solitude would be really good if that was the top meta deck, because in your response to your opponent starting the loop, or in response to your opponent Court of Calling for the combo piece, you would evoke out your Solitude and kill one of their cards at instant speed, which you need to do in order to properly interact with that deck. Unfortunately, there's no deck like that at the top of the timeless meta. Amalia is a really fringe deck, even though I've worked on it. I kind of like it. Same with Yawgmoth. No one's really playing Yawgmoth right now, and there's easier ways to hate out on Yawgmoth. Other creature combo decks like, Devoted Druid and such don't even exist in the time list format, but if a deck similar to Devoted Druid or Amalia combo from Pioneer ended up at the top of the timeless meta, Solitude stocks would go up. Up next, we have the Meathook Massacre, and by the way, if you're wondering about ordering, it's in whatever order I thought of the cards, so it's going to be very random. Meathook Massacre is a situational card in C tier. It is a card that I'm very happy to have access to in mono black decks, because keep in mind, black decks in this format are dark ritual decks, which means you can pay a big X sometimes. Also, black decks in this format are occasionally devotion decks, so the double black pip on this doesn't matter. But what I really like about this card is that it is a removal spell that is mass removal and it gains me life. And it also puts a passive static in play that whenever an opponent's creature controls dies, I gain a life, and I keep that for the rest of the game. And often in mono black decks, you're using either Necropotence or the One Ring to directly translate life into card advantage. So I really value the Meat Hook Massacre highly in those sorts of decks. However, it is a lot of mana to get the board wipe going, so that's why it's never going to be higher than C tier. Up next, we have Shrouded Shepherd, which is probably the most random card if you haven't seen it played. But I've seen this played as a mirror breaker in fair decks like Mardu Energy versus Boros Energy. The Mardu deck will sideboard this in and -1/-1 wipe to kill the opponent's Ocelot Prides, little kitty cat tokens, and the Ragavans. I think it's really cute and really cool, and the fact that it's just a 2-mana 2/2 that can be used as a beater in the deck definitely puts it in C tier. I think it's pretty sweet in the meta right now, and it's a nice little mirror breaker. It's not going to be played ever outside of that specific deck, in my opinion at least, but it's cute in the meta right now. It's something that's C tier today and probably F tier in a month, but hey, I'm happy to have it on the list, and I wanted to include it because it's some really cool tech. Up next, Swords to Plowshares. Timeless is a Swords to Plowshares format. I've called it that before, and this is truly the gold standard for removal, not just in Timeless, but in the entire history of Magic the Gathering. This is 1 mana to remove any creature at instant speed, no restriction, practically negligible downside if your deck is not on the beatdown. It's as good as it gets. It's the gold standard. Often this is a main deck card more than a sideboard card. However, I've often found myself splitting copies of Swords to Plowshares to two between the main deck and the sideboard. So if you are looking for extra removal spells and you do want a single target removal spell, this is the one you want. Up next, we have Prismatic Ending. Unfortunately, in a Swords to Plowshare formats, this card is not nearly as flashy or efficient, but what this card is perfectly versatile. It truly hits any permanent, and it also doesn't suffer against random hate pieces like Chalice of the Void. Oftentimes, an opponent playing Chalice on one will be a death sentence, but this, you can actually overpay X to remove the Chalice. It also removes any stupid permanent. It does not matter the permanent type. As long as it is not a land, you can remove it by paying the X as long as you have enough colors. And what's really awesome about this card is that it's always mana neutral. It's never that you're paying 3 mana to remove something that your opponent only spent 1 mana on. You're generally spending the exact amount of mana that they spent for it, other than some odd cases. So this card is perfectly versatile. It doesn't ever put you behind on meta, but it also never puts you ahead on meta, and it's not an instant, and it's a Swords to Plowshares format, so it's never going to be higher than B tier, but it is a card that you will reach for often in white decks. All right, S plus tier Toxic Deluge. This is the board wipe of the format right now. This is the main board wipe that black decks are playing. It only costs 1 black pip, so it's super splashable as well. Paying 3 or 4 life to absolutely wipe the board of an energy deck before they get rolling is amazing, and everybody has been opting to play this card. I think this card is very, very strong. The life loss is not very much of a downside, and this is going to continue to be the best board wipe in the format until we get a pretty considerable shakeup in the meta. Up next, Anger of the Gods. Oof. 3 mana board wipes, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose on them. Unfortunately, this one being restricted to always 3 damage is tough. 3 mana for 3 damage often puts you behind. By the time you have 3 mana ready, your opponent could definitely have played a threat that has 4 toughness, or something that grew like Tarmogoyf, or just Guide of Souls putting counters on itself, and this will miss pretty often. It does exile creatures, which is sweet, and in past metas, this might have been possible, which is why I'm going to give it F+. It at least has that exile upside. But right now, you should not be registering Anger of the Gods in Timeless. You are not going to be winning games with this card. Up next is Molten Impact, which is a cool alchemy card I want to make people aware of. I think this is a really sweet option for both control decks and like Jund-style fair decks to get a 2-for-1 removal spell in. You can hit the Ragavan on turn 1 when needed, and this will like quote unquote store the extra 3 damage the same way that Galvanic Discharge does. Galvanic Discharge, actually, now I think about it, is not on this list because I think of that as a main deck card in energy lists, but that is an S tier removal spell. This is like the sorcery speed little brother of Galvanic Discharge. 4 damage, it will store the extra damage for later, and that extra damage will go off whenever you cast any sort of instant or sorcery spell, not necessarily another Galvanic Discharge. So in a control deck, you could shoot the Ragavan on your turn 2, and then on turn 3, when you cast your card draw spell, you can hit your other creature controlled by your opponent for the other 3 damage. The only downside to this is that it is not an optional trigger. So the trigger is always going to go off when you cast your own spell. So be careful that your opponent actually does have something in play and you're not the only person with a creature in play. Otherwise, it'll be a little tragic. Actually, no, it doesn't hit your own creatures, but it'll fizzle. All right, up next, Wrath of the Skies. This is the other S plus tier board wipe that is currently defining the meta. This card is amazing, and the reason it's amazing is because it answers all the cute little artifacts and enchantments. Right now, the de facto best creature deck in the format is Energy, and I keep mentioning it for that reason, because this is the deck you're building the sideboard with that deck in mind. One of the ways they can recover from a board wipe, including a Toxic Deluge, is with their unstable amulet. They just put all their extra energy into the amulet, draw a bunch of cards. This kills the amulet too. This destroys all artifacts and enchantments with energy, with mana value less than the amount of energy they paid. People are playing this alongside cards like Tune the Narrative to help them get a bigger X quicker, but realistically, casting this on X equals 2 is often more than enough. And the fact that this can kill anything in the Luris energy deck for 4 mana, often less, is absolutely awesome. A plus tier here for Path of Peril. I think this is almost as good as Toxic Deluge, but it's not quite as good as Toxic Deluge or Wrath of the Skies. This is an awesome card that once again will destroy anything in a Luris deck. It also doesn't care how big the creature is, like Toxic Deluge, so it kills Tarmogoyfs with absolutely no problem. I just think this is a really solid sideboard card. It's the next best thing after Toxic Deluge that a black deck should be reaching for. The cleave cost is not relevant on this spell. You are casting it as 3 mana, kill everything with 2 or less, but that is very, very, very relevant in a Luris format. All right, Crush the Week, F tier. I've been looking for other like red wraths because Anger of the Gods sucks, and this is one that I turn to. It's a 3 mana red removal that also exiles, and I can pay it in installments. And I tried to sideboard it in against Energy, and I kind of got rolled. All right, D tier. This is a card I was really high on before Modern Horizons 3, and I would have put it super high, but unfortunately, Harvester of Misery is really not it anymore. It was a main deck card for me. I was playing mono black with main deck Harvester of Misery plus Reanimate, but unfortunately, the format changed a bit after MH3. The main aggro deck got really fast, which is Boros Energy, and there are some aggro decks that are playing Nethergoyf and Tarmogoyf that don't die to this thing's activated ability, even though they only cost 1 and 2. By the activated ability, I meant the discard ability. So it's tough. Like, this card has been really good for me in the past, where I discard it to kill something, and on a later turn I cast Reanimate to get a big threat and wipe the board. The thing is, the aggro decks are just getting so fast that I can't afford that 5 life to Reanimate, and I also can't afford to wait for 5 mana to hard cast this thing. So, unfortunately, it's in D tier right now. I think it's super fringe, but maybe it can go back up. Up next, Fatal Push, and this is sort of a stand-in for any other like black single target removal spell that you want to jam in your sideboard. I think this is a fine C tier thing. I think if you're in black, you would rather reach for the really good board removal, such as Path of Peril or Toxic Deluge. But sometimes you're playing like the Psychic Frog Luris deck and you might want some extra removal spells. You're playing creatures of your own, so you don't necessarily want the board wipe, so you'll reach for some Fatal Pushes, and it's acceptable. And the festivities. Unfortunately, this card does not have a reason to be played in Timeless right now. I know I did just mention like a Shrouded Shepherd over here and say, oh yeah, giving opponent's creatures -1/-1 is really cute. Unfortunately, End of Festivities doesn't have a creature stapled to it. 1 damage is worse than -1/-1, and there's no reason to dedicate a sideboard slot to this if you're playing like a red control deck, or really even a red aggro deck. Shrouded Shepherd is just up there in C tier because he actually does have a little home right now. And the festivities is, is your aggro deck really going to sideboard this in? No, it's just going to screw up the curve. So this isn't a mirror breaker in the energy matchups, and I don't think the control decks are really going to want to play this when they can lean into much better board wipes or just play a Fury, So unfortunately down to F tier. All right, A tier, a counter spell on my removal list. Yeah, Stern Scolding is a fantastic option. It just says counter target energy deck, counter target Lurrus deck. It's awesome. It hits pretty much anything in the energy deck other than like their artifacts like Unstable Amulet, and it'll hit most things in Lurrus decks other than like big Tarmogoyfs. I think it's really sweet, and if you're a control deck and you're not main decking all 4 copies, you could definitely think about sideboarding up to 4 copies when you're against those decks. Another very similar card that's going to come through is Spell Snare. I think this card's awesome in the meta right now, and it mostly dunks on Lurrus decks. If you think about the Energy deck or the Psychic Frog Lurrus decks, all of their really good cards are 2 mana, and this always trades up on mana where you spend 1 mana to answer 2 mana from your opponent. So I really, really like this if you're building control decks. Again, a little bit more of a main deck card, but I really like it. All right, up next is the Filigree Silex and all sorts of Ratchet Bomb effects. I think these are C tier situational. Like if you have a card in the Great Creator and you're grabbing it out of the card board, it's pretty good, but otherwise, eh. Like maybe if you're playing like a mono green deck and you don't have access to better removal, you could also play this. But again, you're better off playing like red, black, or white to have access to actual good mass creature removal rather than playing a card like this, unless you are a green ramp deck or a card in the Great Creator deck. And up next, also in C tier, is going to be Actual Factual Supreme Verdict. The reason it's down in C tier is just that 4 mana is a bit much, and you can't cheat on the mana cost like Wrath of Skies, and it also doesn't clean up non-creature permanents like Wrath of the Skies does. The can't be countered text is actually pretty relevant in here because there are creature decks and Lurrus creature decks that are playing blue right now, and they will try to counter your board wipe against them. So that is sweet, and that is what's saving this from being an F tier like its little brother Wrath of God. Unfortunately, actual factual Wrath of God, not playable. For 4 mana, you could just be casting Wrath of the Skies and blowing up truly everything, or casting a better removal spell here. Unfortunately, 4 mana at sorcery speed that can be countered. I don't think it's going to ever cut it again in Timeless, unfortunately. But you know what? I'm going to queue up Ranked after this, and I'm going to get rolled by some Teferi player with 4 Wrath of Gods, and I'm going to be mad about it. All right, and this is one of the reasons you're not playing Wrath of God. Temporary Lockdown, very similar to Wrath of the Skies. It's E plus tier, almost S tier. I think Wrath of the Skies is just a little bit more flexible because it can shoot higher and kill things that cost more than 2 if possible. But this is another destroy target Lurrus deck, destroy target energy deck kind of card. In fact, it's exile target energy deck. That's sweet. The only downside is that it can be destroyed, and then the energy player gets all their stuff back, and they get like 600 Guide of Souls ETB triggers, and, and it's all downhill from there. But generally, this card is an absolute slam dunk against Lurrus, and that's why it's A plus, almost S tier. All right, and then A minus, this is very similar to Temporary Lockdown. I just think it's a little bit worse because it does let your opponent claw back into the game because a lot of these Lurrus decks are now built to be very grindy. So letting them eventually have their stuff back and claw back into the game could be a problem. I'd rather play Temporary Lockdown or Wrath of the Skies, but this is not the worst card ever. What's really cool about the alchemy part of this card, I know alchemy, is that the perpetual stuff is truly perpetual. So if you're playing against like a Lurrus deck that has Chthonian Nightmare or some bullshit, those creatures are going to enter tapped for the rest of the game, which is kind of funny. All right, here's another interesting removal spell that's unfortunately just doesn't really have a use against the meta, but I'm going to highlight it because it's something I've looked at in the past, and that is Legion's End. Exile target creature an opponent controls with mana value 2 or less. Hey, that's a Lurrus deck, isn't it? And all other creatures with the same name search their hand and library for the same creature and exile all of them. And that's interesting, right? It's like, exile all the Tarmogoyfs, exile all of the like Ajani's from the energy deck. It's a card that could have utility. I am not sideboarding it in right now. I don't think I'm going to start sideboarding it in, but it's something. Maybe especially if a creature combo deck like Amalia starts to really go on the uptick, you can exile the Amalia, but it's a card in the deck builder's toolkit that's not making the cut right now. It's just something I wanted to share because it's interesting. It has a unique effect on it. Up next is Pest Control, and I know there's going to be some gamers that disagree with this D tier, and they're going to insist to me that Pest Control is great, but I don't imagine this being great against the current aggro decks of the format that are really dependent on 2 drops. If this is a tier list where Spell Snare is in good tier, then I don't think Pest Control can also be in good tier if our Lurrus decks are relying so much on the 2s. It is nice that it is cycling. It is nice that it pitches to both Solitude and Grief, but as a sideboard card, I'm not thrilled to play this. This might change as the meta evolves. It might go up or down in the tiers, but like right now, I'm not leaning on this card at all. Up next in F tier is just another card with a unique effect. It is Screw One Creature type in particular. This isn't just for tribal decks, it can be used against random decks. Like, for example, if you're playing against energy, you can name cat or name human and you'll kill some of their stuff. You know, it's another black removal spell, mass removal that you can lean into if you're playing creatures yourself, right? If you're your own creature deck, like if you're that Lurrus Psychic Frog build and you just want to kill all the cats, you can go ahead and do that. But 3 mana to kill some creatures, just play a real black removal spell, you know? Right, Brotherhood's End, going a lot higher than Anger of the Gods because of that blow up artifacts mode. There are a lot of relevant sideboard cards that are artifacts and enchantments, and that makes Brotherhood's End really good. When you're up against the energy deck, you can choose to either wipe their board or destroy like their little unlicensed Hearse and Unstable Amulet. That's really sweet, and I think that versatility by itself bumps it up 2 whole tiers from where Anger of the Gods went, even though it lost the exile part of the text. Up next is the Ritual of Soot. This one is down in D tier. There is a reason to play it. If you're playing a mono black deck with, for example, Shieldred in it, and not very many creatures other than Shieldred, and your big stupid bombs like Grief and the Troll that you're reanimating, then this does kill everything not named Shieldred or Grief or Troll, right? So there is reason to play this. You're also a Dark Ritual deck, so you can afford the 4 mana. However, I don't think it's a great card that decks should be playing generically, which is why it is in the fringe tier. Up next is Shieldred. If you said to me, Joe, I'm getting beat up by creature decks, should I side in more Shieldreds in my slow, dirtly black deck? I would say, you know what, that's actually a swell idea, because they're going to sideboard out their removal. I've thought about sideboarding extra Shieldreds, like having 3 copies of the main and a 4th in the sideboard of my black deck before, and I think it's not a bad idea. If you think your opponent is really going to sideboard out their removal, or they just don't play removal that can answer Shieldred 1-for-1, it is a good way to slow down the game, gain some life, and close out the game. It's a big stupid blocker that some decks can't go around. It's a death toucher, so if it does trade with creatures, it is going to trade 1-for-1, or maybe just trade 1-for-1 with a removal spell. Is it the best sideboard card ever? No, but I think a mono black deck, or maybe even a Rakdos Scam deck, could appreciate sideboarding in some copies of this card against aggro. Up next is Hitsugyu Consumes All, which is not a card that I think is well positioned in the meta right now, but this has a lot of cool text on it. Destroy each non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. Okay, it does the pest control thing, but then it exiles all graveyards and it flips into something on the reverse side. It is a mana more than pest control, but it does have a lot of text on it, and because it has so much text on it, I'm going to include it in the list. It also could fit into your scam list, pitching to both Fury and Grief, so that is another consideration. Up next is another D tier one, Karn Silex. I think this is only good if you are playing like a mono green Karn the Great Creator style deck that has a lot of mana and a Karn board. It is okay in that situation, but really it is very slow. It does not kill things until the turn after you play it. You are usually dead if you take an extra turn in Timeless, but it's the option that big mana decks have to clear the board. I think there's also Perilous Vault that I didn't put on the sideboard guide. Yeah, I think that card's legal. So Perilous Vault and the other board wipes that Karn can tutor up, I think they're all fringe. You can pick your favorite, but really only play them if you have the Karn the Great Creator and you can just grab them out of your sideboard when you need them. All right, up next in B tier is Unholy Heat. This is a card that I think hasn't been played very much. A lot of the red decks lately just are not Delirium decks. They are playing Galvanic Discharge instead, which is not on the list because I view that as a main deck card. I have not seen anyone with Galvanic Discharge only in the sideboard, but before MH3 drops and before everybody's playing Galvanic Discharge, I would sometimes have Unholy Heats in my sideboard. Like I've had my 4 Lightning Bolts in the main deck, but then when my opponent was playing a big stupid thing, I would have the copies of Unholy Heat to sideboard in as extra removal. And I still think it's pretty good in that purpose if you can support Delirium. So it's B tier if you have Delirium. If you can't support Delirium, then it's obviously not B tier. Up next is Burning Hands, maybe the worst card on this list, but once upon a time I actually did put this into my sideboard, and the reason I did is because it's pretty much an unholy heat that doesn't require Delirium. Now it's really conditional. It has to hit a green permanent, but in the old timeless meta from before MH3 hit, Primeval Titan, Oko, and Uro were 6 toughness or 6 loyalty green permanents that you were very happy to clear off the board. So it was in the sideboard for that specific reason. If a green deck becomes good again and you are playing red and you cannot remove those permanents, this is an option. It is not good right now. Do not put it into your sideboards today, but it is something to be aware of. In D tier, we have Shieldred's Edict, which is a card that was a lot better not too long ago, but I think the removal suite in Timeless has just become a little bit too good for Shieldred's Edict to really be a great, outstanding card. I just think the other options are better. Like there's nothing too terrible about this card. In fact, this is the best Edict ever printed. Your opponent is forced to sacrifice a non-token creature instead of just sacrificing a token if you pick that mode. You can make him go for a Planeswalker, but I don't think it's well positioned. There aren't too many Planeswalkers seeing play in the format that you're going to Edict right now. So that's why I'm down on it for the sideboard. But it could go up in tiers as the metagame shifts. I do think it's a powerful card. The other reasonably playable Edict in the format is Sudden Edict, and it's an F tier because I don't think that there is any reason you would ever want to play it over the Shieldred's Edict. The Shieldred's Edict does give you that flexibility of forcing your opponent to sacrifice a non-token creature or making them sacrifice a Planeswalker, which is very, very useful. This does have split second, but generally there aren't very many effects in Timeless where your opponent can say, I actually mess with this. There's not that many. It's really just counter spells that are going to mess with this right now, and this could maybe be tech against like the blue-black Luris decks that are running around, but other than that, I really don't see why you would put it into your sideboard. I don't recommend sideboarding this right now, but it is a card to be aware of because the tech split second is very, very, very powerful. All right, Pylon. We're getting towards the end of the list, boys. Pylon is a situational card, and I think it is quite good. However, it is only quite good in certain decks, and that is a Yawgmoth style deck with Court of Calling, where you are going to be able to consistently convoke this out for 0 mana or close to that. 0 mana, destroy a creature. Surveil 2 is fantastic. Surveil 2 is a very powerful text in a combo deck like Yawgmoth. So in Yawgmoth, please continue to put this into your sideboards. In Amalia combo, you can put this into your sideboards as well, but I don't think this is generically good black removal that all sorts of black decks should be leaning on. It is situational, but very strong in its situation. All right, Dismember. So it's again situational, but it is really good in the decks that it's good in. This gives mono blue and mono green decks access to actual factual creature removal. The decks you'll see playing this are like mono green, ramp, and merfolk. These are colors that just don't traditionally have access to removal, so they will happily pay 4 life and 1 colorless mana to remove a very problematic creature. Should you play this in a black deck? No. Should you ever play this outside of a deck like merfolk or mono green ramp? No. But will you be happy to have this in your sideboard to deal with problematic cards? Yes. Is it a way in colorless mana to deal with the new stupid Magus of the Moon card? What is it called? Harbinger of the Seas? Yes. Yes, it is. So it does have uses, but it's not generically strong enough to be played in all sorts of decks. It's just get played in decks that can't support all the other removal. Because if you notice, everything on this list is in the Mardu colors. So sometimes you do need to play a ugly removal spell like Dismember to get the job done. One more thing. I was going over the video editing it and I realized I forgot one. This one was in my notes and it is an A+ tier card, so we absolutely have to mention it. This is Fragment Reality. This card is so good because it does deal with pretty much any permanent. It deals with a creature, artifact, or enchantment, and it does come with a downside, unfortunately, but it is 1 mana, instant speed, hit anything, just like Swords to Plowshares. Unfortunately, the downside is a little bit stronger than Swords to Plowshares. Your opponent gets to put a random creature card with less mana value onto the battlefield, but if you go ahead and hit an opponent's 1-drop, their pretty much never going to get anything unless they're playing something like Ornithopter, which doesn't happen. If you hit a 2-drop, it turns into a random 1-drop. However, this is really strong removal, and what I really like using this on is against sideboard cards. Like if you're playing a deck that's dead to Deafening Silence, which is a 1-mana common sideboard enchantment, this is just clean removal for that Deafening Silence, while also being clean removal for a Ragavan or a Guide of Souls on turn 1. I really think this is an A+ tier card. If this wasn't a Swords to Plowshares format, this might even be an S tier card. This is a fantastic card that you should consider for your sideboards, especially because it can also hit Artifacts and Enchantments. And that's going to be it for against fair lists or against fair decks. Keep in mind, this is dependent on the current metagame. For after Modern Horizons 3, the meta might change, new cards might be printed, and I'm also one dude, so my opinions could be wrong. All right, part 2, we are going to go over sideboard options against unfair decks this time. Starting up with the classic for the genre, Pithing Needle. Pithing Needle is one of the most iconic sideboard cards in Magic's history, and it will go straight to S tier for this reason. Pithing Needle is the most efficient card for shutting down a wide variety of combo decks. Currently in the Timeless meta, the best combo deck, Show and Tell, does not happen to get hit by this, but this is such a versatile card that is good against so many decks that it feels wrong to not put it right into the S tier. The next best combo deck in Timeless, in my opinion, is Charbelcher, which this of course hits, but this is also good against any activated ability that is relevant against you. You could name your opponent's engine their best card, as long as it is an activated ability. Longtime Magic players know what an activated ability is and isn't. Newer players might get a little bit tripped up on it, but I'll give you a little hint. Deathrite Shaman's abilities, all 3 of them are activated abilities. Haha. It does not count as a mana ability because it does technically target. You can also go ahead and name lands on here and name the abilities of lands, such as Shifting Woodlands or any of the man lands. This card is absolutely awesome, and it has been an all-star in sideboards of every format it has ever been legal in. Modern Horizons 3 gave us an idea of what a 2-mana Pithing Needle might look like, and they hit the power level nail right on the head. This is awesome. This is often worth paying the extra mana for. However, it's not always better than Pithing Needle. In my opinion, in fair creature decks where you're tapping out and you're being really efficient with your mana and you're playing efficient threats, you should stay playing the original Pithing Needle. However, if you're a control deck, if you're the deck casting mana drain, if you're the deck that's usually leaving your mana up, I think you should switch to Flute. Flute does have a really, really sweet upside of allowing you to wait for your opponent to actually cast the card and waste mana on it before you throw the Flute down. So what happens against Pithing Needle pretty often is that if you turn 1 Pithing Needle Necropotence, the mono black player will just not play their Necropotence because they know it's not going to do anything and it's just going to lock them out of drawing cards. But if the mono black player plays Necro and you say, okay, instead of countering it, I flash in Disruptor Flute, they're just going to concede on the spot. It's an amazing, satisfying feeling to watch a Necro player concede like that, but it's also very good against random Planeswalkers, things like Minsc and Boo that could otherwise kill you, turn into, oh, your opponent just wasted 4 mana, and you're getting nothing out of that Planeswalkers, they can't even activate it. That extra line of text with spells costing 3 more to cast can be very occasionally relevant against certain decks. That line is mostly there for Modern so that it can host Cascade cards like Crashing Footballs. But in Timeless, it's an occasional thing that can show up, but not too common of a use case for the card. But this is a very viable alternative to Pithing Needle that will also go in S tier. And I think if your deck has extra mana, or if you're usually holding up mana, you should play this instead of Pithing Needle. All right, all the S tier bangers are going to start off this tier list. We have Thoughtseize, which is the best discard spell ever printed. This is generally a main deck kind of card, but I have had some creature decks that are utilizing black or splashing black, and I keep the Thoughtseizes in the sideboard because I want to have a high creature density in my main deck. But against unfair decks, I do want to board in all of my Thoughtseizes, and Thoughtseize is also just going to be a bit of a stand-in for other removal spells. We're going to go over Duress and the other ones for sideboarding against control decks, but if you already main deck Thoughtseize and you want to bring in Duress as well, I would also call that an S tier sideboard in. Just one thing to consider is that a lot of unfair decks are playing Leyline of Sanctity nowadays, so be a little careful with overdoing it on the discard spells. Don't go above like 8 discard spells really ever unless you have a way to blow up enchantments or force your way in. And one more S tier banger to start off the list. This is Deafening Silence. This is my go-to sideboard card against Show and Tell. This is 1 mana, turn off the best combo deck in the format. Only casting one non-creature spell per turn completely defeats the point of omni-telling, and you can just smack them with your creatures the next turn and kill them before they actually cast enough spells to win. This is an enchantment that dies to Force of Vigor, and the combo decks do have ways to kill it, but this is 1 mana. Force the combo deck to answer it. It is very good against Show and Tell. It is also good against Goblin Charbelcher, because generally how that deck wins is they beseech the mirror to cast something for free, and that's usually their Belcher, so you can't do beseech the mirror lines with this. This is also good randomly against Dark Ritual into Necropotence decks, because this turns off Dark Ritual. You cannot Dark Ritual into another non-creature spell when this card is on the board. And generally the kinds of decks that I'm putting this in are things like the Boros Energy deck that is casting a maximum of one non-creature spell per turn, because it's almost all creatures in the deck. Just a couple of removal spells and sideboard cards, and I can just cast one of those per turn really easily. So because it's 1 mana answering so many of good decks in the format, it's going to go right to S tier, and it is going to stay there. It is going to be a sideboard card that I compare other sideboard cards to. Gideon of the Trials. Aha! Here's the spicy tech. So this is one that has come onto my radar recently as a way to screw up the Show and Tell deck. Because the Show and Tell deck, it's evolving, right? It can now clear a Deafening Silence. If you put down 2 Deafening Silences, they'll play Force of Vigor to kill it. But this stupid Planeswalker is something they can't kill, which is really funny. Show and Tell does not play removal spells that interact with this permanent. And if they put an Atraxa in play and try to swing at it, he could just +1 on it. Or if they Shifting Woodlands copy something, try to attack, he just +1s that permanent. So this is a really funny way to stick up the finger to Show and Tell. However, it's 3 whole mana, so it's gonna be infringed here for right now. And the good white decks are playing Luris right now, so not too much room for my boy. But I love this card. I hope more people start playing it in their sideboards. It's so funny. All right, up next in B tier is going to be Surgical Extraction. Now, keep in mind, we have a separate category for Graveyard Hate that Surgical Extraction is going to show up in separately. I'm viewing this purely as you are up against a combo deck. Some combo decks are graveyard-centric, but most of them, what you're going to want to do is you're going to discard your opponent with a Thoughtseize, and then you're going to Surgical Extraction their combo piece out. I think this is pretty good include. It is really nice to just be able to knock a Show and Tell player out of the deck by surgicaling their Omniscience, and there are a lot of Show and Tell builds that are now also having Shifting Wilds or Shifting Woodland as a backdoor way to do the Show and Tell combo, so you can go ahead and extract the Show and Tell out of their graveyard whenever they go for that line. There's a couple of combo decks that do utilize the graveyard, but not that many, so this is going to be B tier. It goes up and down based on how graveyard heavy the main combo decks in the format are. And right now it's B tier for combo decks, but keep in mind it also has utility against graveyard decks, which we'll talk about in the other list. So overall, it's actually higher than a B tier sideboard card in the format right now. I'm playing it in so many of my decks. All right, here's an F tier one that I personally like. It's something that I've used in the distant past before Show and Tell, but this is a little way to tax your opponent. So if they're playing a Storm kind of deck, it does tax them. It can blow up a Artifact or Enchantment and deal more damage to them. And when I say tax, I mean it doesn't tax mana, it just taxes their life total. So if you're playing an aggressive deck, this could be a way to close out the game. But realistically, you could just play another creature, or if you're paying red-green, you could just play Breakout to grab the best creature out of your library, give it haste. I'm sure that's going to do more damage. So this is an old option that I had leaned on in the far past that kind of got power crept out by the format increasing in power and people getting better at it. But hey, gotta mention it. We gotta populate F tier with some of the cool stuff that still might have utility somewhere. Up next, we have High Noon, which is going to be a direct comparison to Deafening Silence. This is worse than Deafening Silence for a couple of reasons. Obviously, it is twice as much mana, but on it, it says each player can't cast more than one spell each turn. Earlier, when I was talking about Deafening Silence, I said that the decks are playing it are mostly like the Boros Energy deck and aggressive white decks, where they're casting multiple creatures per turn. They do turn 1 Deafening Silence, and then they just dump creatures, and you're casting multiple creatures a turn for the first 3 or 4 turns of the game. If you put High Noon on the board, you are done multi-spelling your creatures, and you have to put High Noon down on the board on turn 2, otherwise your opponent can win the game. So this really does slow down these aggro decks. It's a bit more suited to slower decks, like I have a Obosh, Boros Scam deck that's using Ephemerate to Ephemerate Furies and Solitudes. This is really well suited for that deck, but unfortunately it's not Obosh compatible. But if you're playing like a slow Boros Ephemerate or just like a slower Mardu deck, then yeah, you could definitely consider playing this card. The extra text on it is very relevant upside that you will kill your opponents with, or you can use it to clear a really problematic permanent. But yeah, it overall goes in F and A tier because it is a very good hate piece, just not as good as Deafening Silence. And we have the third best version of this effect on Arena, and unfortunately, it just gets so much worse. It loses that extra activated ability upside of High Nooner. It costs 3 mana. The difference between 2 and 3 mana on this format is astronomical. 2 mana means that you can beat Show and Tell with it. 3 mana means you cannot rely on this card to beat Show and Tell. Don't put this card in your sideboard. And it's got the same problem before, as it taxes all spells, not just non-creature spells, so it's going to slow you down a lot. Archon of Emeria. Breaks my heart to put this in F tier because this is a very, very, very powerful card. This is a card that sees Legacy and Vintage play because of how powerful it is. Like, it's a crazy card, but it goes all the way to F tier because, as we saw in the last tier list, this is a removal format. This is a Swords to Plowshares, Lightning Bolt, Galvanic Discharge, blah, 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 blah format. This dies to all of the common removal spells and it costs 3 mana. So you're spending 3 mana to lose to a 1 mana removal spell. Combo deck has no difficulty removing this usually, so unfortunately it's in F tier. Pains me to put it down there because it is a really powerful card and it is a card that I'm going to keep having my eyes on, but with how Timeless is now, it's tough for me to imagine this actually having an impact out of the sideboard or even in the main deck. Like I've tried main decking it before and it just falls over and dies. Really unfortunate. All right, we got all the stinkers lined up here. Up next is Flusterstorm. This technically can counter every storm spell on the stack, but play a different counter spell against unfair decks. There's no storm decks, explicit storm decks that are at the top right now. There are better counterspell options, which we are going to go over later in the video. And of course, there's the generically good counterspells like Counterspell and Mana Drain that you obviously want to be playing. So how many counterspells are you really going to put in your deck? This is too many after you consider your Counterspell, Mana Drain, Spell Pierce, and the other ones that are on this tier list. Up next in D tier is Damping Sphere. This is a sideboard card that does see a lot of play in other formats like Pioneer, but it has the unfortunate detail that it does not work when there's an Omniscience in play. If your opponent is bypassing the mana cost on spells, they do not care about the Damping Sphere attacks, therefore it does not do anything against the premier combo deck of the format, which is Show and Tell. And unfortunately, a lot of these cards get evaluated through the lens of Show and Tell. Show and Tell took Gideon, which is a random 3 mana bulk rare that probably costs 26 cents at your LGS, and it actually put it on a Eternal format tier list. So unfortunately, if it doesn't work against Show and Tell, it's no good. It does have utility against other decks, so this is something you might very occasionally reach for, but I would not be putting it in my sideboards right now, right now. It is colorless too, which is nice, so it can go in any sideboard. Up next is Test of Talents, which is a much better counter spell against these unfair decks. I actually think it's pretty good. Obviously, it's competing for slots with Mana Drain and Counterspell, which are generically very, very strong. But I like this 2 mana Counterspell with the Extraction effect stapled onto it. Against combo decks like Show and Tell, this is very close to just being Negate, which is a playable card when you know it's going to hit every card in your opponent's deck. But with the upside that it can have the Extraction effect go forward. And what's cool about this one is you don't have to use it on your opponent's combo card. You can use it on any card. And you don't necessarily have to care about the extraction effect on it. It is just 2 mana counter any instant or sorcery, which lines up really well against the current Show and Tell builds. Like it does counter pretty much everything in the deck. After that, we're gonna have the Stone Brain. Ooh, this is gonna start the trend of extraction effects getting put a little low. So Test of Talents was nice because I said just 2 mana to counter something, forgetting about the extraction effect is like fine enough against these combo decks, so who cares? Unfortunately, Stonebrain 4 mana to extract something. Not great. The reason it's D tier, not F, is because it is colorless. It can be used with Karn the Great Creator. If you have a Karn board, it can be used in big mana decks where you don't care as much about the mana, but realistically, Show and Tell can kill you before you can activate this. So it goes to D tier, maybe even F tier. F tier in most decks that aren't playing Karn the Great Creator. All right, here's another F tier one. Would you like to remove show and tell after your opponent has already won? I mean, it can't be countered. That's the one upside here, but no, I have seen this in people's timeless sideboards. That's why it's on the list. It's not cutting it anymore, guys. Don't put this card in your deck. Lavinia, this is a sweet one. Now, unfortunately, she has only 2 toughness and thus dies to all of the removal in this hyper efficient removal format, but she is only 2 mana, not 3 mana, so it's not as tough, and she taxes so many things. She taxes any sort of spell that no mana was cast on, so that includes all your scam elementals, and it also taxes the show and tell deck, of course. Each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with mana value greater than the number of lands they control, so it will tax the Dark Ritual deck. It is a really, really, really sweet sideboard piece. Just the only unfortunate part is that it does die to removal. The classic it dies to Doomblade argument. It could be S tier as well. Like if you wanted to put this in S tier, yeah, I would agree with you. So if you're playing a creature deck that's in these colors, definitely could play it. The only tough part is that it is in 2 colors, and there are not that many creature decks in these colors. So yeah, we'll see. I saw Yawgmoth double splashing this with Court of Calling and treasure tokens, and which was kind of funny. You gotta mention Thalia. Don't play Thalia in an Orcish Bowmasters format. Don't do it, even in your main deck. This is not going to beat Show and Tell or any other combo deck, really. It's gonna die to Bowmasters, and it's gonna fall over and die. Like Mr. Killer Bean over here. Listen, I get it. Death and Taxes is fun. I like being the good guy too and playing the Thalia deck, but don't do it if you want to win. If you want to have fun, have fun. All right, Tishana's Tidebinder. This gets a C tier because I think this is an okay effect to have access to. This is like more of a main deck effect. So if you're a control deck that's playing like 2 copies of Tidebinder in the main deck and you want to have 4 in certain matchups, like if you're up against the Charbelcher deck, sure, you can go ahead and do that. But it gets C tier because it does have to go in that deck. I don't think every deck should be bending over backwards to try and squeeze Tishana's Tideboard into their sideboard in order to counter things. Up next is Invasive Surgery, which goes a little bit below Test of Talents. It is sweet because it costs 1 mana less, but unfortunately it can only hit sorcery spells, which makes it like a little bit less generically useful than Test of Talents, and it does have a hoop to jump through for the extraction effect. So I'm not super high on this, but I do see control players playing it, and like it's certainly better than a lot of the stinkers in F tier, I'll tell you that. Control Mage could probably be a little bit more articulate than me on the pros and cons of this card versus Test of Talents versus just running more copies of Counterspell. Up next in F tier is another extraction effect. I don't think you should be running 3 mana extraction effects because your opponent could win the game for 3 mana with the wonderful card Show and Tell. Your opponent can also go Dark Ritual, stupid thing, Beseech the Mirror, play a Charbelcher, win. Don't do this. Don't do this to yourself, okay? Up next, Sorceress Spyglass. So unfortunately, this used to be a pretty decent card, but Modern Horizons 3 showed us what a 2-mana Pithing Needle should look like. So Sorceress Spyglass has really, really fallen off. Honestly, maybe I could have even put this in F tier, but F tier is like full of the true stinkers, like extraction effects. I can't put this in the same tier as extraction effects. It does technically work. It's just twice as much mana for Pithing Needle, and you just get to look at your opponent's hand, which is not nearly as much utility as all of the random stuff on Disruptor Flute. Died again. Oh, so you're telling me that we can play Sorceress Spyglass, spend 2 mana for a Pithing Needle, and instead of just dying to Artifact and Enchantment removal, it also dies to creature removal? Literally every creature removal spell in the format and all the Orcish Bowmasters that just happen to be in my opponent's deck? Oh wow, I can't wait to register this card. I'm so excited. Okay. There's a lot of F tier stinkers. Oh, I skipped the slide for Stifle. Stifle is also an F tier. Don't sideboard that in against combo decks. Don't. If you're happening to play Stifle in your main deck and because you're having fun, you can do that. I don't think it's a great card, but don't sideboard it in specifically against combo. You're not going to win by randomly stifling their triggers. They will just cast more spells next turn and probably win next turn. All right, Thorn of Amethyst. It's D tier. It doesn't have a home right now, but it's a tax and it does the Thalia thing, and it doesn't die to Orcish Bowmasters, which I think there's some merit over there. And it also protects itself by making like Force of Vigor cost one more to target it, so Force of Vigor is no longer free here. Just little bits of upside here, but I haven't seen people really play this. All right, this one's all the way at the end, by the way, because I originally had it in another category. I had it as like a deck-specific hoser against free spells, but I said this is just so generically good against almost every combo deck that let's put it in the combo deck section. Vexing Bauble is S tier. This is great against Show and Tell. This is also really good against Scam Elementals. This is a 1-mana colorless spell that I could also cycle for an extra card by paying another mana. This is awesome. Like this goes in so many of my sideboards. This is a all-star sideboard card. It's good against scam decks and unfair decks alike. And then lastly, we have the Roiling Vortex. Again, like Vexing Bauble, I had it in the other category and then moved it over. This is pretty much a 2-mana version of Vexing Bauble in red. It does do a little bit more chip damage, and instead of countering the spell outright, it deals 5 damage to your opponent. So if your Show and Tell opponent throws the Omniscience into play and then immediately Frozen Grips this thing, they can still win the game. But they would also, they would not be able to do that into a Vexing Bauble because the spell would just get straight up countered. Here, they would take 5 damage, and assuming they had more than 5 health, they would be able to win the game. So that's why it gets dumped down from S to A. It is possible for a Show and Tell style deck to win through this. It also costs an extra mana. However, it does have extra upside. It is extra damage when you're playing an aggressive deck. It also randomly taxes other things. Like if you're an aggro deck against a scam deck, this is really sweet to have access to. And it also has that life gain prevention built into it, which is pretty sweet. Not against combo decks necessarily, but it is sweet in some situations. All right, and that is it for the unfair cards tier list. Please do not register extraction effects unless they are free and also removing cards from your opponent's graveyard, or unless they're just a counter spell as well. Don't play 3 or 4 mana cards that just extract things from your opponent's library. Do not play 2 mana cards that die to Orcish Bowmasters, and don't try to stifle your opponent's win con. All right, up next, we are going to talk about all of the cool cards that you can sideboard in against Control Andes. Up first is going to be the classic discard spell, Thoughtseize. We talked about this briefly in the unfair decks part, and we are going to be putting it at S tier. This is one of the best cards that you can have to look at the control player's hand and take the key piece out of their hand. The key piece can be the sideboard card for your deck, it could be a board wipe if you are playing a creature deck, or it could just be their best counterspell or piece of interaction, or it could be their value engine like Teferi. It's your choice, and you get to make that choice based on how the game is going to unfold. You get to pick any card with Thoughtseize, which is amazing, and the 2-life downside is not relevant against control gamers, so this is going to be the S tier gold standard that everything else on this list is going to be compared to. Up next is Duress, and against control gamers, this is pretty functionally similar to Thoughtseize. It is possible to miss when they have creatures in their deck, but most control decks in Timeless aren't playing too many creatures. Some are playing Tishana's Tidebinder, which is something that could hate on your particular deck. If you are having trouble with that, it is one of the cards that could cause problems with Duress. Also Snapcaster Mage and a couple of other more marginal cards, but realistically, this is S tier right next to Thoughtseize. In most matchups, it will act as your 5th through 8th copy of Thoughtseize when you do want it. There is another cool alchemy card that is directly adjacent to Duress that I wanted to talk about. This is essentially Duress, except you don't get to see their lands for some odd alchemy reason, and you lose 2 life like Thoughtseize. But if they didn't have any non-land cards in hand, you get to draw a card. So this is a Duress you can't whiff with, but also late in the game you could just cycle it for 1 black mana and 2 life. Which I think is super dope, and it has a little bit of extra upside. Is it strictly better than Duress? No, but this is a card that I've played in my Death Shadows list before. The 2-life list came in clutch with the Death Shadow, but even outside of a list like Death Shadow, this can be in the Duress spot as your 5th through 8th copy of Thoughtseize, if you so choose. Then up next we have Inquisition of Kozilek. This is a bit of a miss against control gamers. It can miss some cards. It can miss the delve spells that get discounted like Dig Through Time Treasure Cruise, and I often want to take Treasure Cruise out of people's hands. If they're playing a 4-mana board wipe or a big planeswalker, it is also going to miss against those. So this is similar to Duress, but it has a higher miss chance. So I'm going to put it down in A tier, but this is not the worst card ever. This is, in a way, more main deckable than Thoughtseize and Duress because it doesn't come with the life loss, so it's not a total throw of a card when you're playing against something like Energy. So you will see like Demir Laris decks main decking this sometimes, and it's not the worst card to have in your sideboard, but I do think the three options that I put in S tier are better specifically against control decks. Up next, we have the premier piece of one mana stack interaction in Timeless, which is Spell Pierce. And it's only in B tier for the reason that it does fall off if the game goes long enough. It is the best way to protect your combo on the stack for one mana. And if you are a blue deck and you're able to hold up the one mana, Spell Pierce is going to be awesome. It will eventually fall off. It only taxes by 2, but if you're the combo deck and you are trying to win on like turn 3, just holding up one mana for a Spell Pierce, it's going to get you there pretty often. So this is a good card that goes in B tier. Up next, we have Pact of Negation. This is a really powerful card, but it is situational. This is the kind of card that you can put in your unfair deck sideboard card. And if you're playing something like Goblin Charbelcher, where you are all in on Dark Ritual, Beseech the Mirror, Belcher, activated that turn, win instantly, or if you have a win on the spot kind of hand with a Show and Tell deck, you can use this as a 0 mana counterspell because you will not have to pay that 5 mana. You are not getting a next upkeep. You are either winning the game or you are losing the game. So in the right deck, this is amazing. But in general, it does have to go to C tier because not every single deck can afford to play this, of course. This is just for the really degen combo decks that want a free counterspell to defend their combo. Up next in B tier is Defense Grid, which I view as taking up the same sideboard slot as Pact of Negation, and after thinking a little bit, I think it is slightly better than Pact of Negation. It can defend you against multiple counterspells, and the spells cost 3 more to cast, which is even more of a tax than Spell Pierce. So a mana drain will end up costing 5 mana. So if you play Defense Grid on turn 2 and do your Show and Tell combo on turn 3, your opponent is not possibly going to have enough mana to interact with it, which is awesome. And even if they somehow do have enough mana to interact with it, like let's say they went first, they had 4 mana in play, they were all untapped, and they Spell Pierce you, and they're able to pay the 3, this Defense Grid is going to keep kicking, and it's going to keep taxing every single counter spell for the rest of the game. So I do think it's a really solid card. Now keep in mind, this is only for unfair decks against control. If you're playing a fair creature deck, I don't think you should be sideboarding in Defense Grid. Most of the things on this list, outside of like the S tier Thoughtseizes, it really depends on how you're building your deck, whether or not these go in your sideboard. So please keep that in mind. Up next, we have Juggernaut Peddler, which I'm having so much fun with lately. I think that this is the best Thoughtseize on a stick that they've ever printed. It's an alchemy card. I know, some people don't like alchemy. But this is a 2 mana, 2/2 vigilance. It is in 2 colors, black and white. And if you are playing those colors, when you play him, when he enters the battlefield, you get to look at your opponent's hand, you get to exile a card from their hand, which is so much better than discard, and they get a Juggernaut. Juggernaut is the classic card if you don't know. It's a 4 mana artifact, just a big stupid creature that attacks and blocks. It doesn't block actually because it has to attack each combat. That's the text on it. But if you're playing a creature deck against a control deck, you can not care about the Juggernaut. You just let the Juggernaut hit you, or your opponent is most of the time never going to even cast the Juggernaut because it costs them 4 mana when they're playing a control deck that has counter spells in it and they need to hold mana up. So I absolutely love Juggernaut Peddler. I've been playing him in value decks and Birthing Ritual decks, enjoying playing his ETB and then sacrificing him. It's such a sweet card. And if I don't have Juggernaut Peddler in the main deck of those types of decks, I definitely have him in the sideboard. So if you're in these 2 colors, you're playing a creature deck, I highly recommend Juggernaut Peddler in your sideboard. Up next is Mana Drain. This is sort of a stand-in for, oh, should I put in more 2 mana counter spells and we're playing against a control deck? And the answer is it depends. Mana Drain is an incredibly strong card, so I feel really stupid rating it any lower than B tier, but really, this card should be in your main deck, and maybe it's okay to have extra copies in your sideboard if you don't have all of them in your main deck. But I really think that 2 mana counter spells, they should be main decked if they are in your deck at all. But I'm not much of a control mage. Maybe there are some good arguments to split them, main and side, but the more mana drains you have, the better you're going to do against other mana drain decks, right? Up next is Dovin's Veto, which I think is very underrated in the format right now. This spell can't be countered, counter target non-creature spell. I think it's really sweet. It is a way to defend yourself against control Andes, but it is also a way for control Andes to really bully you, and you can't counter their counter spell back. I think this is B tier. Maybe I should have put it in C tier. I just think it's a little bit underplayed, and I do want to pull people's attention to it because, like, I've pretty much never seen this card, and I think it should show up at least sometimes. Up next is Mystical Dispute, which I don't think is very good right now. Unfortunately, just hitting blue spells is simply not enough to defend your combos. You're going to get attacked by spells of all sorts of colors. Yes, when you are just fighting against stack interaction that is blue, it is better than Spell Pierce, but otherwise it is quite worse. And yes, you can cast it in bad mana leak mode for 3 mana, but I don't think that's where you should be in Timeless right now. Up next, we have a creature that can protect your creatures from board wipes. The reason that she is all the way down in F tier is because there's no like real deck that she fits into right now. There's no superhuman heavy deck right now, but theoretically, if a human deck were to get put together, this is one that you should be aware of, and it could go up higher, and you could even main deck this because it was also passive graveyard hate. So it is one to have on your radar, even though it's down in F tier. And up next is Boromir, which is a card I actually have registered. He has the same effect as Jirina, where we could sacrifice him to give creatures indestructible. Note, it is all creatures, not just humans, so it's so much better. And he does the Vexing Bauble thing. That's sweet. The only problem is that he's 3 mana. He's a 3 mana, 3 toughness creature. Like Archon of Emiria, he dies to every removal spell in the game. So it's a little bit tough. Just the texture of how Timeless is, there's so many removal spells in this format that it's so tough to play a 3 mana creature that doesn't give you an ETB or a dice trigger, but at least you could sacrifice him in response to a removal spell pointed at him. But again, I have played this. This is not the worst card ever, and the fact that it also hates on free spells is really sweet. If you have a way to cheat him out of your deck with Quarter Calling, I definitely think this is worth including. Up next, we have Flare of Fortitude, which is a card that hasn't found a home yet. The logical home for it would be like Boros Energy, but when you think about the cards in Boros Energy, it actually can't support this because the only white creatures that deck really runs are Ocelot Pride, your Guided Souls, and the Ajani. That's only 12. Ajani slipping into a Planeswalker half the time, so that's less than 12. Guided Souls and Ocelot Pride are like 2 of your best cards, and the 2 cards that get removed so often, so you don't always have them in play, and when you do, you don't want to sacrifice them because they're so good. So it hasn't slotted into that deck, but it is a good option in my opinion. It's going to be in D tier, it's going to be fringe, maybe there's a deck that can pick it up, maybe it never gets played. I think it's a card at least worth considering and having in the back of your mind as long as you have a lot of white creatures to sacrifice. Up next in A tier, we have Leyline of Sanctity. This is for the unfair decks here. If you're playing a fair deck, please don't sideboard this in. But if you are playing an unfair deck and you think your opponent is going to be packing that discard, bring in the Leylines. Bring it in. There are some people who even main deck them. In the Goblin Charbelcher deck, most builds play Beseech the Mirror and thus main deck the Leyline of Sanctity because it's a junky enchantment that you could sacrifice to your Beseech the Mirror to get the full value out of it. And all of the ones who aren't main decking it are putting it in the sideboard, and show and tell decks are even sometimes main decking this. It is a very, very common card. It's in only reason it's in A tier and not S tier is because it does not go in every deck. To be in S tier here, it's got to be very close to this can go in every deck that can support its colors, and there are plenty of decks that could play Leyline of Sanctity that don't. It's only for unfair decks, but it's really good there. All right, then in D tier, we're going to have Mass Discard. Go Blank is like the best Mind Rot version that they ever printed in paper. It is just Mind Rot that exiles a graveyard, but exiling a graveyard is very relevant in a format with Delve spells. But it's 3 mana and Timeless in this economy. Unfortunately, not going to cut it. And we have another cool alchemy card that's adjacent to Go Blank that I wanted to point out. There is technically a 2 mana Mind Rot in Timeless. It gives your opponent a choice. They can choose not to be Mind Rotted, but then you get a random card out of their library if they do choose that way, and that random card might or might not be totally useless, but if you're against Control Andy, you might get a counter spell to counter their counter spell. Could be pretty sweet. I just wanted to point this out. I don't think it's necessarily good. I don't think you should necessarily be jamming copies of it, but we're going to put it in Fringe right now, just so that people are aware there is a 2 mana Mind Rot on Arena that is pretty cool, and if you have ways to discard the extra card that this gives you, then it is card advantage. Alright, in A tier, this is more of a main deck card, but I'd get a comment if I didn't include it, is Cavern of Souls. Uh, Counters, control Andes don't have like too many cards that are like stack interaction that don't counter, so this will make a creature like Primeval Titan resolve and make the ETB happen. The only ways they can interact with this on the stack are something like Reprieve, and with that card you just get to go again next turn, and I think Subtlety as well, just puts it on the top or bottom. Aether Gust as well, that's another one that could hit a prime time. People are not playing Aether Gust right now. Subtlety stocks are pretty low right now. Some control Andes are playing 2 copies, but not too many. And I haven't seen a Reprieve in a hot minute, so Cavern of Souls stocks are going to the moon. Definitely recommend playing this, but you should main deck it. If you can main deck it, I don't see why not. Alright, and then we got a D tier Tinny card. So if you're playing a green or amp deck and you just want a big stupid to hit your control opponent, you can consider something akin to Tyrannix Rex. This is a can't be countered, trample, ward 4, haste, toxic 4 boy. He just gets in there. Ward 4 is very functionally close to hexproof in this format, and he's bringing that eat power of trample, haste, as well as toxic 4. As a lot of text, he's going to kill your opponent in 3 hits. So it's an option. I'm not saying it's a good option. That's why it's towards the bottom of the tier list, but it's certainly an option. Also, there's one, I made a PowerPoint for this. That's why we're here. You can see my slides. We skipped the slide for thought distortion. I'm going to talk about it really quick. I probably just forgot to make a slide for it before I put it onto the PowerPoint. This card is just one I wanted to call attention to. I don't think it's good. That's why it's an F tier. It is a 6-mana spell that says it can't be countered. Target opponent, is it exiles? Reveals their hand, exiles all non-creature, non-land cards. So 6-mana FU to control Andy. I don't know what deck would play this right now, but it is theoretically a 6-mana uncounterable FU control player. Alright, and Tyrannix Rex is going in D tier as well. Really fringe. Thrawn, my boy. I have registered this card before. I'm not sure about in Timeless, but like, this is a cool one. It can't be countered. It can't be the target of non-green spells and non-green abilities. It has Indestructible on your turn. I mean, that's a sweet card. It's 5 whole mana though, so maybe don't play it in Timeless, but look at this boy. I had to put him on the list. Maybe he should be an F tier and not D tier. I feel like some of these D tiers could be an F tier, but this is a very bottom heavy list against control Andy. Alright, and then we get the last card here. This is another one I don't see played much and maybe could be an F tier instead of D tier, but there are reasons you would want to play this card. Malevolent Hermit is a 2-mana 2/1, so it attacks for 2 power for the investment of 2 mana, and then you could sacrifice it, spend 1 blue mana to more or less spell pierce something, pay 3 instead of pay 2 for spell pierce, and it could be used to defend your own spells. It has a backside for after you sacrifice it, so you can cast it with Disturb, and the non-creature spells you control can permanently not be countered, as long as he's on the battlefield. So this is pretty sweet. There's a lot of text on this card. It doesn't see play right now. It doesn't really fit into any decks right now, but like, there's enough text on it that like I want people to be aware of it. This part of the video has a lot of these cards where I'm like, hey, I want you to be aware just in case the meta shifts and just in case you need it. But that is the reality of building a sideboard, and that's the fun part of making this video, is I get to dig for hidden gems here and maybe try to predict what the next hot sideboard staple of 6 months from now is going to be. All right, and that is going to be it for the Control Andy part of the tier list. These are your cards that you could bring in to dunk on control, to defend your own combo, and to defend your own creatures. A lot of these are situational, unlike the other tier lists. For example, something like Defense Grid is for your unfair decks. Something like Flared Fortitude is for fair decks, trying to fight against control. But all of these cards are a good way to say middle finger to the control mage and try to make sure that your gameplay actually happens. Alright, up next we are going to be talking about Graveyard Hate in Timeless. We're going to start off with Unlicensed Hearse, which I think is a very, very strong card in Timeless, and it is a card that I have been playing a lot. It has a couple of upsides, then a couple of clear downsides as well. Its upsides is that it is asymmetrical, meaning that if you care about your own graveyard, it is not going to attack your own graveyard unless you choose to. It is also compatible with Lurrus, so I am playing it often in my Lurrus creature decks, and this also acts as a win condition and an extra bit of reach. Lurrus creature decks are weak to board wipes, so if you've had an unlicensed Curse cooking all game, you can get 10 or 12 cards exiled under it. If your opponent board wipes you, you can untap, play a creature, crew this, and kill your opponent with it pretty frequently. It's also just a big attacker and blocker in the late game against other creature decks. I think it's really great for all these reasons. However, downsides of it is that it sometimes isn't fast enough. It is 2 mana, so if your opponent's doing reanimate BS on turn 1, turn 0, you can't interact with that. It has to tap to activate itself, and it only hits 2 cards at a time, so sometimes you will activate it, and then your opponent will get to do something in response, or sometimes you will activate it, and your opponent will activate their own Deathrite Shaman or Psychic Frog in response. Sometimes you can't win, but I still think that this is the best piece that a Lurrus deck could possibly have access to, while also not sacrificing their own graveyard. Up next is Rest in Peace. This is a card that currently doesn't have a home in a deck, but this is the best piece of graveyard hate in the format, in my opinion. This is 2 mana to unconditionally exile everything everywhere. The problem is, white decks in this format are currently graveyard decks. All the white decks are either leveraging Lurrus or leveraging Flage, and you don't want to give that up just to play Rest in Peace. But I do think this is a very, very, very strong card that will be making a comeback at some point. Maybe if Flage budges out of the meta, or maybe if graveyard decks become very, very common, where it's worth playing this over Flage. Up next is Stone of a Wretch. This is a card that I have been kind of forced to play before. I was trying to play an Obosh deck, and I wanted asymmetric graveyard hate because I am also playing my own Flage. And this is the thing I settled on. It is good against a couple of things. For example, against an opposing Uro, Flage, or Kroxa, when it dies, it doesn't go to the graveyard, which means they can't be escaped ever. It also stifles all of your opponent's death triggers, which is pretty nice. But overall, it still allows the cards to exist in the graveyard. If they are put there by milling, it still allows things to be reanimated unless you have 2 mana up to sacrifice it in response. This is C tier, suboptimal graveyard hate that you can play if you are in the situation where this is one of your few options. For example, if you were relying on your own graveyard and you need a 1-drop graveyard removal for something like Obosh Regions. Up next is Surgical, which I think is S tier. Now, I'm already regretting putting this in S tier because this is also the most misused card I've ever seen in Timeless. People are worse with this card than Brainstorm. It is a very skill testing card because it is free and you can do it at any time. And I've seen so many people fuck it up. But this is an S tier card. This is how you interact with your opponent's graveyard for 0 mana. And what's awesome about Surgical is you can often 2-for-1 your opponent because you are going to let them waste resources and then Surgical in response. For example, your opponent casts Faithless Looting, and then they cast Surgical targeting something, and then only after then they cast Reanimate targeting something that they put into the graveyard through their looting or Stitcher Supplier or whatever, and then only in response to that Reanimate do you Surgical. So you completely fizzle the Reanimate, and then you make them look stupid for wasting their whole turn milling themselves. So I think that this is a really strong card for that reason. It is the only way to interact at 0 mana instant speed with your opponent's graveyard, and that is something that is very necessary in a format with the card Reanimate. But like, please. I'm gonna make a tutorial on this card. like I have to. I can't tell like the arena gamers who are learning Timeless, hey, jam 4 Surgical, and it's not gonna go well. Up next, we have Grafdigger's Cage, and I am actually pretty high on Grafdigger's Cage, but it doesn't have a home in a deck for the same reason that Rest in Peace doesn't. There's a lot of decks that want to leverage their own graveyard, and this is symmetrical. However, this is probably the best 1-mana graveyard hate piece. Creature cards and graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield. They also can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. That is really, really strong. It shuts off Reanimate. It shuts off any sort of flashback spell. It does not prevent some things, like it doesn't prevent your opponent's dice triggers like Rest in Peace does, but this is still 1 mana, and it also passively hates on things like Natural Order, which is absolutely sweet. Up next is Withered Runestone, which is Grafdigger's Cage's bigger brother. It costs an extra mana, but it says non-land permanent cards and graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield. So if you do encounter a situation or a future metagame where it is common to reanimate an artifact or an enchantment instead of a creature, then yeah, you can go ahead and play this. This has been played over Grafdigger's Cage in Pioneer for the Greasefang deck. Greasefang is a card that lets you reanimate any vehicle, and they were like reanimating a 10-mana vehicle and killing their opponents. Very funny. So if that ever happens in Timeless, this is a card you want to lean on, but really it's just a budget version of Grafdigger's Cage, if you could even call it that. So definitely play Grafdigger's Cage over this. That's why this is in B tier and Graph is in A. Endurance is pretty sweet. It is A tier. It is the other 0-mana graveyard interaction spell. The only problem is that it costs you card advantage to be 0 mana. What's really sweet about it, though, is that it is a 3/4 flash, so you can do things like eat your opponent's attackers with this card. It's currently not a metagame that's super conducive to the 3/4 flash eating things part of the card. You're not often going to sideboard this in against a creature deck where you can take advantage of that, but it is a cool card that is going to continue to be a part of the metagame, and it is definitely A tier on power level. In different metagames, it could even be S tier. Brave Expectations. So this is one that I have never played, but I keep seeing my opponents play it, and it surprised me every single time on the power level. Because when you just read the card, it doesn't seem that good. The options are exile 3 target cards from your opponent's graveyard to gain 3 life, or heist the opponent's library. And that's the stupid alchemy mechanic where they get to take a non-land card from your library. This has blown me out the way that Surgical can when you try to reanimate things. Of course, it costs 1 mana, not 0 mana like Surgical, so obviously it goes down several tiers just for that. However, it has the upside that it essentially cycles itself for 1 mana. Heist lets you pick from 3 non-land permanents in your opponent's graveyard. 3, not actually, it's not land cards, not non-land permanents, right? I don't play with the card, I don't know. The thing is, you get the choice of 3 cards, so you are getting a good one. So it's crazy. It's like as if Impulse and Surgical Extraction had a, split card where it didn't do the extraction part of Surgical, but it still can hate on the graveyard in a pinch, and it hits 3 cards too. So like if I try to reanimate one of my creatures, my opponent can take that out and also take out my alternate reanimate target, so I can't do it again next turn. It's really impressed me. I did not think this card would be good the first time I saw it cast, but every single time my opponents have cast it in their blue-black Luris deck or their Jund deck, it's been fantastic. Alright, D tier, Remorseful Cleric. This is one you might not have seen before, but it is one that has crept into Luris decks, specifically like the Birthing Ritual Luris decks that I've been working on. It is the only creature that is Luris compatible that can unconditionally exile a whole graveyard. I think that is really sweet. I think it is worth playing for this text. It is something that you can bring back with a Chthonian Nightmare or a reanimation spell to keep doing it again and again and again. It's worth having on your radar, but it is fringe. It really only goes in that deck. In that sort of deck, honestly, you might as well just play Unlicensed Curse in your sideboard instead of this. But if you have a card like Birthing Ritual that helps you go through your deck, or a Chord of Calling, I think this is worth playing in the sideboard as your one of chord target. Up next is Callous Blood Mage, and this is another one of chord target kind of card. It is in D tier because it can really only be played by one deck, and that is Yawgmoth. So Yawgmoth can chord for this, and it also has multiple modes, which is pretty sweet. I think you could also play this in a Birthing Ritual deck if you're not playing a Luris Birthing Ritual deck. Its alternate modes are pretty good as well. You can draw a card, or you can create another 1/1 for Yawgmoth or Birthing Ritual purposes. This is actually a pretty decent card, and it's the kind of card that is in your sideboard not just because it's graveyard hate, but because it's also very versatile. But by itself, in a vacuum, is this a S tier graveyard hate spell? No. This is a cool utility card for Yawgmoth decks and Birthing Ritual decks, and it is an option for them and only them to use as graveyard hate. But good in those decks. Up next is the other S tier graveyard hate card from this format, which is Leyline of the Void. This is another true 0 mana graveyard interaction spell. It is fantastic. It can be removed, and once your opponent removes it, they go back to graveyard shenanigans as usual. And unlike Surgical Extraction, you can't blow out opponents with this. But since it's 0 mana, it's fantastic. It's going in S tier. The only problem with it is that it does have to be in your opener, which means if you draw it, it's often a dead draw. But still, in a very graveyard heavy meta, you are going to be bringing this in. We're currently not in a super graveyard heavy meta where you are going to be playing Rest in Peace and Leyline of the Void in a lot of your decks. But if the meta does shift a little bit in that direction, I anticipate seeing a lot of Rest in Pieces and a lot of Leyline of the Voids. Up next is Scavenging Ooze. I have to put this here for the Gen gamers. This is outdated technology. Don't register this card. Don't do it. There's better options, I promise you. Don't play Scavenging Ooze in Timeless in 2024. Up next is Lion Slash, which is very functionally similar to Scavenging Ooze, but it's actually going to go up a tier, and there's a couple of reasons why it goes up a tier. First, it is not a creature. Well, actually, it is a creature. It is a equipment and a creature, but it can dodge a little bit of removal by reconfiguring itself, and also it is tutorable off of Stoneforge Mystic, and Stoneforge Mystic is a very powerful and kind of underplayed card in the format. So because it can fit into like these white Stoneforge Mystic value decks, I think it goes from F tier to D tier, but realistically, he's on thin ice. This is another Scavenging Ooze effect. If you couldn't search it up with Stoneforge Mystic in your neat little mid-range deck, then you're probably also F tier. All right, what's up next? We got Soul Guide Lantern. Soul Guide Lantern is one of the best options that you can play with Lurrus if you want to keep your own graveyard. I said Unlicensed Hearse was the best. I think this is the next best thing for a Lurrus deck to do. It is something that you can cycle for a card if you need to, and you could cycle it every turn. So for 2 mana every turn, you can just draw a card with Lurrus if you have this. It is fantastic. Just the downside to this is that it doesn't draw you a card when you exile the graveyard. So like Stone of Wretch, for example, it says 2 tap sack when you exile the target graveyard, you draw a card. This one does not do that, but it is 0 mana to exile the graveyard, so a little bit of trade-off over there. If this drew you a card unconditionally, I'd be so happy to play it, but since it doesn't, it is going to be B tier. It's right behind Unlicensed Curse for Lurrus decks, and Lurrus decks should sincerely consider playing this card. Up next is Relic of Progenitus. This is another symmetrical one, and it's not seeing much play right now because a lot of decks use their graveyard to a mild degree. This could go in Lurrus decks, it could go in a lot of decks, but unfortunately, the activated ability where it exiles all cards from all graveyards does hurt the current status quo of Lurrus decks and Flage decks that are running around. It's interesting because I keep saying graveyard isn't a huge part of the meta, dedicated graveyard decks aren't a huge part of the meta, but decks that do use the graveyard a little bit, like scam decks that just have the 4 copies of Reanimate, Lurrus decks, Flage decks, are popular. And it's not always worth having the sideboard card just for those cards. It's obviously matchup dependent. I sideboard in Unlicensed Hearse for Flage all the time when we're playing an Energy Mirror, but there aren't that many decks that are like all in on the graveyard where it's worth bringing in this symmetrical graveyard hate to break the status quo. But Relic of Progenitus is a really sweet card. It taxes your opponent's graveyard every single turn by pulling a card out of it. Often in Timeless, people can fill graveyards much faster than that. But you can spend a mana to sack it, draw a card, and exile all graveyards. Same thing as Soul Guide Lantern, except you're paying an extra mana. You're exiling both graveyards, and you get a card out of it, which is pretty sweet. Notably, it exiles itself, so you can't loop it with Lurrus. Also, one thing to note is that this is a crime trigger every turn. If you are playing any deck that cares about crime, you can tap target player every single turn. All right, up next is Cling to Dust. This is situational because it does really only go in like blue-black spell-oriented decks, but I do think this is a pretty sweet card. I think this is definitely a reasonable option for those decks to lean on, but I've seen those decks lean on Grave Expectations instead, and I think Grave Expectations has performed a little bit better. But Cling to Dust is still a fine card. I still see people register it. If you're the kind of gamer who likes to register Cling of Dust, I think it is acceptable in Timeless. You just need to have the right deck for it, and if you're a Cling to Dust gamer, you know what that deck looks like. Up next is Hitotsugu Consumes All. This is an F tier because it is too slow to be proper graveyard hate because you have to play it on turn 3 and the graveyard does not go away until turn 4. But this card has a lot of text on it, so it is going to make the list because it has a lot of text on it. It destroys all cheap permanents, exiles all graveyards, and it flips into a threat on the backside. There might be a meta deck where this is very good against it. This is already like kind of close to being good against like a Boros Flage deck. The first chapter blows up the Guide of Souls, the second chapter exiles the Flage from the graveyard, and then the third chapter flips into something good, but realistically it's just a little bit too slow for current Timeless and to play against that deck. But there's so much text on this card, I felt like I had to include it in the list. I just have to put it in F tier. Up next is Tormod's Crypt. So this is C tier. It is situational. I think you really should only be running this if you are playing like a Karn board and you can fetch this with Karn and then have a 0 mana graveyard hate spell. I think Soul Guide Lantern does a much better job at 1 mana at being a generic single-sided graveyard hate piece. I don't think there is too much reason to run this card, but if you truly need a 0 mana graveyard hate piece, or if you're playing Karn and you want to be able to fetch your 0 mana graveyard hate piece, you can go ahead and lean on Tormod's Crypt. I think the other options in SA and B tier are better, but this is an option for you. And that is it for Graveyard Hate. This is the smallest category, and we got a nice wide spread of things. There are a lot of very powerful Graveyard Hate spells in Timeless, namely Surgical, that has a very high skill ceiling. So perhaps I will make a separate video just to talk about Surgical, because, oh man, I've seen some interesting Surgicals on Arena, guys. I'm losing my sanity out here. All right, up next we have Artifact and Enchantment Hate. A lot of the cards on this specific list act as counter sideboard cards, meaning I'm going to be going up against Show and Tell, I'm going to bring in my Deafening Silence, and they are going to bring in these cards to blow up said Deafening Silence. So up first is Haywire Might, which I think is the best creature artifact removal in the format right now. I think that this is a card that all sorts of Lurrus decks should go ahead and lean on, and all sorts of creature decks, all sorts of Court of Calling decks, any sort of deck that is using creatures for value or has a way to recur creatures should be leaning on this card right now. It is Artifact Enchantment removal on a stick. It has that little bit of extra upside of getting you the 2 extra life. And I have played a lot of decks that are really good with this. Of course, it's good with Lurrus because you can play it back, but I've been playing a lot of Birthing Ritual decks lately. And that is a great way to either sacrifice it for value if your opponent doesn't have an artifact or enchantment, you just sack it to your Birthing Ritual. Or if they do, you get it with the Birthing Ritual, and then you blow up the thing. I've seen it played in Yawgmoth decks before, where they play Court of Calling, so they can pull their 1 copy of Haywire Might out of the deck, and then blow up the Pithing Needle that is naming Yawgmoth. I think that this is a fantastic card. I think this is the best creature that has removal on it, or has artifact enchantment removal on it. And I've seen all sorts of decks tutoring it up for the sole purpose of blowing up artifacts and enchantments. Up next is Force of Vigor, which is the classic 2-for-2 removal spell. So Wizards of the Coast decided to make some free spells and make the downside that you need to have a second card, so it costs you 2 cards, it costs you card advantage. But then they made a free spell that blows up 2 things. So this is S tier mostly as a counter sideboard card for decks like Show and Tell to run, so that the Show and Tell can blow up a Deafening Silence at a Roiling Vortex with 1 card and then go ahead and immediately combo off. This is a fantastic card for those sorts of decks. All that you need is a density of green cards, and if you're playing Show and Tell, you can Omni-Tell, put your Omniscience into play, and then just cast this for free off of the Omniscience. You don't even need the green card in that case. So this card is fantastic and is going to stay in S tier for the rest of its life. Up next, we have Pick Your Poison, which is, I wasn't sure to put this in S or A tier. I don't think this is quite as strong as the other two, but this is a really great option for 1 mana. Each opponent sacrifices an artifact, an enchantment, or a creature with flying. Notably, that can even get around something like Hexproof, which is so good, right? Your opponent could have Hexproof off of Leyline of the Sanctity, or their creature could have Hexproof. It also is notably very good against Vein Ripper, which is a card that fell out of the meta a little bit recently. I think it's still popular in Best of One, but a lot of people were cheating in Vein Rippers with Sorens, and that card has a disgusting word ability that you can't always pay. This is a good way to make your opponent sack that Vein Ripper. So I really like this as a versatile sideboard card, and I definitely think it's worth including. I think it hovers between S and A tier depending on the meta. I just went ahead and put it in S tier just because I think it's so flexible and it offers so much for just 1 mana. Up next, we have Prismatic Ending, which also got a B tier for creature removal, and it's the exact same reason here. It's just versatile, it answers every permanent. Is it flashy doing it at instant speed? No. Is it going to get you ahead on mana ever? No, it's actually going to keep you at mana parity. But that's what you need sometimes. Sometimes you just need a card that can answer any permanent and keep mana parity, and it is flexible enough to also be able to answer the turn 1 Ragavan that will kill you, but it could also answer the Artifact and Enchantment sideboard card that is being played against you. I really like this card. It is solid B tier. Up next is Fragment Reality, which was also a creature removal spell in A tier, and for the same reason, it's going to be A tier here. I think it could have honestly even been S tier. This, like, Pick Your Poison is really kind of between the tiers, Specifically for blowing up artifacts and enchantments, oftentimes the artifacts and enchantments you're blowing up are specific 1 mana hate pieces that were brought in against you, something like Deafening Silence, Grafdigger's Cage, or Unlicensed Terrors, Roiling Vortex. So when you hit a 1 mana one, it just goes away forever, and if you hit a 2 mana one, your opponent gets a random 1 mana creature out of their deck, which is not going to be a hate piece against your deck, like Rest in Peace or Unlicensed Terrors or whatever. So I think this is very, very strong, and part of the strength comes from the versatility. Same with Prismatic Ending. Honestly, I could have put this in S tier. I think this is just really crazy strong. Up next is Assassin's Trophy. I have seen decks play it. This is a way to blow up truly any permanent, which is awesome, but it does come with the downside of ramping your opponent. The decks I've seen play this are things like Charbelcher that are really all in on the combo, and they don't care about ramping the opponent. So if you are all in on your combo and you can support green-black, then I think Assassin's Trophy is a fine choice. I think if you're playing a random fair deck, I do not think this is a fine choice at all, but this is a really good option for combo decks to be able to get rid of anything, truly anything. Up next is Culling Ritual, which I've been really impressed with in the one deck I've seen playing it. So I'm going to put it all the way up in B tier. Maybe that's too high of a rating, but I do want to get people's eyes on this card. I have seen Charbelcher play this card. Goblin Charbelcher, the current builds use Beseech the Mirror to get any card that's mana value 4 or less out of the deck and cast it. So this is a way with Beseech the Mirror to blow up all of your opponent's hate pieces. So if they have a Pithing Needle on Belcher and a Flute on Belcher and a Deafening Silence, you can blow all of them up, and you get 1 mana per thing you blew up. So if you're against Energy or another aggro creature deck that dropped all those hate pieces, you're also going to blow up all their creatures, and you're going to get so much mana. You will get enough mana to just cast your Charbelcher out of your hand and maybe win on the spot. I am really high on this card. This is a card I want to bring to more people's attention. I feel like it's a card that slipped under the radar because it's not like this was a standard all-star that it's really played anywhere else. But specifically in that Charbelcher deck, at least, this is a really, really strong card for them to have access to one copy of. All right, up next we have Feed the Swarm. This is going to go in B tier, even though it's sometimes a bit mid on power level. However, if you're playing a mono black deck, this is the best that you get for dealing with enchantments, and it is the upside of also being able to hit a creature. So it can hit that turn 1 Ragavan that is going to snowball for the low price of 1 life, or you can blow up the Deafening Silence, or the Leyline of Sanctity, or the Rest in Peace that's preventing your deck from doing its thing. I think that versatility is what keeps it up in B tier, and it is the best option in mono black. If this was, for example, a white card, it would be way down in D tier because white has Fragment Reality. Why would you ever play this over Fragment Reality or Prismatic Ending? But sometimes you're in mono black and you have to play a card like this. I think this is the best option in mono black. Up next is Meltdown, which is a card that is an F tier, but I have to like stipulate straight up in the text up there that this is very powerful, and if somebody figures out a Kappa Cannoneer deck, it goes right to the top. Just right now, this is not how you do it. I've seen people sideboard this against me. I was so confused. I was playing Energy, somebody sideboarded this in and spent 3 mana to kill an Unstable Amulet. I was very confused. I just killed them the turn after they cast this. So don't sideboard this card right now. But it is a very powerful one to have your eyes on for whenever the meta shifts to support more artifact decks. Up next we have Molten Collapse. This is more of a main deck card and less of a sideboard card, but I wanted to point out like how relevant the second mode on this is. Because I played like a fair amount of Rakdos, and the amount of times that I have blown up like a Pithing Needle, a Deafening Silence, Soul Guide Lantern, or Chalice the Void, like some other random hate piece that my opponent played out of their sideboard with this is crazy. So many of the cards, if you look at the previous tier lists, are 1 mana. People are dropping 1 mana hate pieces left and right, or ones that are technically 0, like Chalice, and you can go ahead and blow those up really easily with this card. I don't know if this is a card that you necessarily put in your sideboard, it's more of a main deck card, but if you're in Rakdos, this is a nice card that will pitch to your Grief and your Fury that will also blow up hate pieces, which is awesome. Oh, blows up Vexing Bauble for that deck too. Very big. Up next is Boseiju, which is another S tier one. This is fantastic. This is essentially an MDFC land and disenchant effect. It's awesome. It is close to a free roll for decks like Show and Tell to play it because it acts as an auxiliary land drop for them. It is a card that they will main deck a copy or two of. I think that this is a great option. Is it the card that you should sideboard 4 copies of? No, but it is something that if your deck is weak to Artifact and Enchantment Hate after sideboarding, you should main deck the first copy definitely, maybe play the second copy, maybe that second copy goes in the sideboard. This is a card that you should have in your deck if you are playing an unfair deck that is weak to artifacts and enchantments. Because you can blow that artifact and enchantment up uncounterably. That's a really important point. This is not counterable. The opposing blue deck cannot counterspell the Boseiju. You could just do that on your opponent's end step at instant speed and then try to go off on your turn. Up next is Frozen Grip. This is situational, but is very, very strong specifically against Omnitel and specifically in the mirror. So if you're playing like an Omnitel mirror, your opponent does Show and Tell, you both throw the Omniscience into play. If one of you has Frozen Grip, that player wins, because Split Second is a very, very, very powerful line of text. And your opponent can't do their Born Upon the Wind bullshit win in response to that. I think I once put this in a non-show and tell sideboard just to see if I could dunk on a show and tell list just by doing this, but 3 mana is a lot of mana, man. It's very tough to cast this for its full price. But it is a Mirror Breaker and Omnitel, so it will go in that situational tier. If you're playing Omnitel, this is definitely something that is worth having in your sideboard, or at least considering over playing Force of Vigor, because Force of Vigor is incredibly good. It's hard to say no to that card. Up next is Terra Sunder. This is something that had been like really high and really well played when Jund was a popular deck, but Jund decks and fair style Jund decks especially have really fallen off. So this card has really gone down. However, this is Disenchant that exiles in green. It also has the kicker to remove a creature. Actually, non-land permanent. Wow, that's good. It is a good card, but it is 4 mana for that really good mode. And unfortunately, the deck that was playing it, Jund, really fell off, so it's infringed here. However, it's an option. It's definitely something that people should be aware of. It's just that there's more hyper-efficient form options in the format now, like Pick Your Poison and Force of Vigor. And there's also hyper-efficient creature and permanent removal, like Fragment Reality. So does this really have a place in the format? I don't think so anymore, but it's there in D tier because it was played a lot very recently before MH3. Up next is another D tier one. This is a very fringe disenchant, so it's a sorcery speed disenchant that has a big 6-drop attached to it. Why would you ever play this? I was looking through like old sideboards because that's how I got the info for this deck. It's not all off the top of my head. I did try to dig for as many different sideboard cards through the history of Timeless as possible, and this was an option that Primeval Titan decks would play, because sometimes they have 6 mana to cast a big stupid. It's an option. It's fringe because it can go in that deck. So if you're playing a big mana deck or you're playing something that can cheat on mana cost, then sure, you can have your Stormcloud Vanguard as an alternate disenchant effect. I don't think it's good, but it is fringe playable in that deck. Up next is Get Lost, which is a card that is really versatile, like Fragment Reality. However, it costs twice as much mana as Fragment Reality, and it also cannot hit artifacts. So for those specific reasons, it is going to go down 2 tiers, but I still think that this is a fine card. This is probably the second or third best mono white card that you can have in the slot. Fragment Reality, Prismatic Ending are probably better, but this is an instant where Prismatic Ending is not. So it's definitely something that is worth considering. Up next in E tier, I've been really impressed by Abrupt Decay. Abrupt Decay is kind of a meme card in formats like Pioneer, like it's legal in Pioneer, but it's not quite that good. However, I think in this format, I've seen like show and tell decks run this, and this is a nice uncounterable way for them to blow up the hate pieces that you sideboard in against them on your end step and then try to go off on the next turn. I think it's pretty sweet. Maybe it belongs in B tier over A tier, but it is a card that I have been impressed with lately. And I think a lot of decks could be leveraging this as an uncounterable way to remove sideboards. So remove sideboard cards. Up next is Dawnbringer Cleric. It's another one that I found in some lists. This is technically a Lurrus compatible way to either exile a card from a graveyard or destroy an enchantment or gain some life. It's like a silly little modal card. But all those modes are really, really underwhelming. Not the biggest fan of this card. On power level, it's probably an F, but it is a Lurrus compatible card. It is something that you could put in your Lurrus deck or your Birthing Ritual deck or your Chthonian Nightmare deck, technically. But at that point, just put Haywire Might in your deck. Knight of Autumn is the more playable version of Dawnbringer Cleric. It is a 3 drop, so it is not Lurrus compatible, but it does gain you more life than Dawnbringer Cleric. It can hit an artifact or an enchantment instead of just one, and it can become a much bigger body if you need it to be. I think it is a really sweet card, and there aren't any decks that are really playing it right now, but it's good enough. I think it's good enough to make the cut in some deck at some point. I think it still goes into C tier just on power level. I think it's a fine option for creature decks to have access to, especially if you're like a Court of Calling deck. You just court out your one copy of it. Up next is a Braid. It's not a card I see play right now, but you see there's not that many red cards on this list, and this is going to be the highest ranked mono red single target instant speed removal for artifacts on this list. If you want instant speed single target artifact removal and you're mono red, this is your option right now. It's not great, but it's still going to be on the list because I think it's the best thing in Red's arsenal for single target instant speed. And there's Brotherhood's End, which is the red card that is going to get ranked a lot higher. I really love how it can blow up all artifacts with mana value 3 or less while also being a creature sweeper. I think it has serious utility and serious use in this metagame as a result. But both sides of it aren't the best thing ever. Sometimes 3 damage isn't enough. If you go back to like our against fair decks tier list, I said like Anger of the Gods sucks because it's not enough. But this card does have enough like flexibility and versatility that I think it is at least B tier. Maybe it's a little bit lower. It's obviously metagame dependent. Like right now, it's not that good. Like Meltdown is F tier right now. But if we do hit a meta where artifacts and enchantments are more common, this is going to go even higher. And by artifacts and enchantments are more common, I mean artifacts specifically. If we hit a more artifact heavy meta or a more small creature heavy meta, stacks of this go up. Up next is Back to Nature, which is a card that's in the format that I never see. So I want to bring everybody's attention to it. Is it busted right now? No. Is Force of Vigor better than this card? Absolutely. Does it blow up all of the enchantments? All of them? Yeah, it does. It is only 2 mana, too. That's sick. Wilt. Ah, saw this in somebody's sideboard. My screen's freaking out, but it's not freaking out at OBS. All right. Wilt is F tier. I saw it on somebody's sideboard, so it's included in the list. This is one that has been power crept. Some people had played it in the past. It's 2 mana destroy target artifact and enchantment with cycling, but we've gone over many cards that are similar to this, and they have better upside than just being able to cycle for 2 mana. Up next is Ancient Grudge. This is a situational card. If you're playing like a Dragon's Rage Channeler style deck and you are surveilling a bunch of things into your graveyard and you're passively putting this in your graveyard, I think it's really, really good there. If you're not doing that, then it is technically a 2-for-1, but you have to be in Gruld colors to take advantage of it. It is situational. Maybe it should be more fringe, D tier. It's a card you can lean on, but you have to very specifically be Gruul, and I think that you should be surveilling things into your graveyard to get like true max value out of this, to get essentially like quote unquote free card advantage out of this. Up next in D tier is Rex Sage. This is a little bit worse than Knight of Autumn, but this is something that you could, Court of Calling for as your one copy of. So if you are a green deck that is not white and you can't support the Knight of Autumn, you could still play actual factual Reclamation Sage in your deck. Though I do recommend having a way to get it out of your deck if you are going to sideboard it in and just sideboard in the one copy. So Court of Calling is a common way to do that. Birthing Ritual is a common way to do that. It just goes in Yawgmoth style creature decks. Up next is K Command. I, it's funny because I always make fun of like the one of K Command gamers, but the one of K Command has actually been some pretty reasonable artifact removal in this format. I think if you're like a mid-range gamer and you want your one of K Command to blow up some artifacts and get a creature back from the graveyard and get that little 2-for-1, I don't think that's the craziest thing ever, especially if we live in like a Grief Fury world, because you can always just cast or pitch this to your Fury on turn 1 or turn 2. And if it's not a game where you need to go lightning fast, then you can use this for the card advantage. So like in the context of a lot of people playing scam decks, I think this is pretty decent. This is a nice way to blow up that Vexing Wobble and get a creature back from your graveyard, or it's a card that just pitches to Fury and Grief when you don't need it. Up next in F tier is Outland Liberator, which makes me kind of sad because this is a card I liked a lot, and this is one I used to lean on a lot, but unfortunately this is just Haywire Might that costs an extra mana. You're never really flipping this in Timeless, unfortunately. So, sorry, you don't compare well to Outland, compare well to Haywire Might. It is a card that I've liked in the past, and maybe there is a world where this card will flip consistently and be a mean threat, but I doubt it. Up next in D tier is Brazen Borrower. And this, I guess, holds the place of all blue bounce effects. I think this is the best blue bounce effect that your deck could be playing. It is D tier because it is the best that your deck will have access to, and maybe you need it. It's not good. It might be F tier. It's really not good. I put it in D because this is the best that it gets in blue, but the best that it gets is not very good in this color. Please play one of the other four colors on this tier list to clear some artifacts and enchantments. Up next, we have Archdruid's Charm, which is a card that is main decked often in primetime decks. But thinking about it specifically as a sideboard card for artifacts and enchantments, yes, it is very, very strong and very, very versatile, but it has that triple green mana pip cost that is going to make it very difficult to run. And I think the kinds of decks that want to run this card are going to be main decking it instead. So specifically as a sideboard card, it is down in D tier, but it is really sweet main deckable artifact and enchantment hate for Primeval Titan decks if those things do come back into the meta. And then to close it out, we have actual factual disenchant, which I'm going to go ahead and put down in D tier. This is a 2 mana instant speed way to blow up an artifact or enchantment deck without a downside. If you are playing a fair white deck, I don't think this is the worst card that you could ever put into your deck. It is better than Prismatic Ending in the sense that it is an instant, and generally Prismatic Ending is going to cost you about 2 mana to get rid of most worthy artifact and enchantments. It compares to Get Lost, but it doesn't give your opponent the map tokens, loses the downside of not being able to hit a creature, and it doesn't have the downside of Fragment Reality. But it is just 2 mana to only hit artifacts and enchantments, but if I saw somebody put this in their sideboard, if they were playing blue-white control or like a very fair white deck, I wouldn't think it was the craziest thing ever, but like you really do need like a blue-white control or a very like spell-oriented blue-white probably deck in order to play this. But I have seen some people play it, and I don't think that it is that terrible to play like the actual white disenchant if you don't have access to the other colors and you're worried about the downsides of some of the other cards and you want to be playing at instant speed. All right, and that is the final tier list for artifact and enchantment hate. Of course, a lot of these things will change based on meta. Meltdown's an F tier, even though that card is obscenely powerful. A lot of things can go up and down based on how the meta is and based on what decks can run them. So keep that in mind when you're building your decks. But this is a rough power level list. It's very hard to go wrong with anything that is an S or A tier. All right, home stretch. This is going to be the 6th of 6 tier lists in this video. Today, we are going to be going over all of the remaining miscellaneous cards that are hate pieces for very specific decks. So a bit of a forewarning, there are going to be a lot of stinkers on this list because a lot of people seem to get really cute when they get into this category and they over sideboard and they put in cards that really aren't great. I'm going to tell you right now, there is only going to be one card in S tier and 0 cards in A tier. And that one S tier card is Blood Moon. Blood Moon is the only absolute all-star card on this list. Blood Moon is absolutely fantastic if you can support it. It hates on all sorts of decks and all sorts of greedy mana bases. People are being very, very, very greedy with their shock and fetch mana bases in Timeless right now. I think Blood Moon is underplayed. I have amazing success every single time I play it. I've even been main decking 2 copies of Blood Moon in some of my white-red decks. This card is absolutely phenomenal. Please play some Blood Moon decks. I might make a separate video on like how to build a Blood Moon mana base because it's a concept that might be new to some people, but if you can support Blood Moon in your deck, do it. And Blood Moon's not that restrictive. Like I've played Flage decks where you have to pay double weight to cast the Flage, and played Blood Moon, and I've been totally fine. This is an amazing S tier staple card, and it's going to be a staple for the rest of Timeless's existence. Up next is Sun Cleanser, which is the second highest rated card on this tier list, and it's high because, you know, it hates on the top deck right now, which is Energy. But I'm not super high on it. I think if you have the ability to play a sweeper like Wrath of the Skies instead of playing Sun Cleanser, then you should be playing that sweeper instead of playing the Sun Cleanser. I also think that if you wanted to argue and say, I would just like to play extra copies of Swords to Plowshares instead of playing Sun Cleanser, I would also be inclined to agree with you. However, if you're playing the Mirror, then this is a Mirror Breaker. If you're playing a creature deck, then this is a way to hate on the energy strategy, especially if you're playing a Court of Calling God Moth style deck and you can find your 1 copy of Sun Cleanser and just throw it onto the battlefield, then this is fantastic. So this is one of the very few FU specific dex cards that will actually be rated decently highly on this list. Up next is Eidolon of the Great Revel, and it is C tier situational because I think this is only good if you are playing burn decks, but if you are playing a burn deck, this is a great way to chip in that extra bit of damage. It's not a specific hate piece against any deck, but it is a good way for a burn deck to matchup dependent, kind of lock their opponents out of the game if your opponent is dependent on casting a lot of cheap creatures and a lot of cheap spells. Then Eidolon of the Great Revel can essentially put them in a position where they don't have enough life left to cast enough spells to get themselves back into the game. Up next is Winter Moon, which is Blood Moon's little brother. Unfortunately, the Moon family dropped Winter Moon on his head when he was a little kid, and he never ended up being like his brother. I'm a Blood Moon lover and a Blood Moon enjoyer, but unfortunately, Winter Moon is not the same card. It does still allow your opponents to have access to mana, unlike Blood Moon. They can still untap their non-basic lands just one at a time, but they can untap one and then use that mana to kill the Winter Moon if they have to, or they can just ignore it. I'm not loving it. Unfortunately, this is F tier. I really had hopes before Modern Horizons came out that maybe this could go in mono black decks. You could Dark Ritual it out early, but no, it doesn't hit on fetch lands in the same way as Blood Moon. They can just tap their fetch land to go ahead and fetch up a basic with a Winter Moon already on the battlefield, versus Blood Moon makes that fetch land into a mountain and it just doesn't work. It's a shame. Up next is Harbinger of the Seas. I don't think this is a good card. I don't think this is a card you should lean on in your sideboard. I think it's maybe defensible to main deck if you're playing like a fish deck, playing a bunch of merfolk, playing a bunch of wizards, and you're playing Spreading Seas, and then you're combining Spreading Seas with this to really get there. But as a sideboard card by itself, I wouldn't lean on it. It did kill me once, which it like surprised me. I saw like a blue black Psychic Frog Luris deck, sideboard out Luris and sideboard in this, and I was totally not expecting it, so I didn't play around it, and I got blown out by it. But that was once. I think 99 out of 100 other games, I just have a removal spell available. I float mana, and then I shoot this. I don't think that this is a winning card. This dies to every removal spell in a format that is dominated by very efficient creature removal spells, so I wouldn't recommend playing this card or any Magus of the Moon style effect. Up next is Containment Priest, which is a card that I am very high on. This card hates on a lot of different things. It used to be a very strong contender to hate on natural order decks, but this also hates on the card Reanimate. It hates on Chord of Calling and anything that tutors creatures out of the library, such as Birthing Ritual. It also hates on Chthonian Nightmare. There are so many use cases for this card. I think is really, really underplayed right now. This almost could have went in the graveyard hate section because it does technically hit on all those reanimation stuffs. But in addition to that, it also hates on casting from library. Well, not casting from library, cheating from library, like Court of Calling, Natural Order style stuff. And it also hates on like any sort of ephemerate flicker style builds, which is kind of crazy. You could use it alongside your own Philia to permanently exile things. Trust me, I tried that. It was way too cute. Philia is not that good of a card. But this is a really, really strong option that I think is underplayed right now. Up next is Ashiok the Dream Render. So this is a card that hates on fetch lands statically. It also hates on a couple of other random cards in the format. And this used to be a card that you would slam as a sideboard piece against primetime decks. Primetime decks have fallen out of the meta. So this card has lost a lot of its utility. It is also a card that like mono black decks used to be happy to Dark Ritual just to cast this on turn one as a hate bear. But it's not the same backbreaker it used to be. It is a hate piece that can get attacked by creatures, so if your opponent is able to resolve one creature, they can just slowly attack this down and get rid of your lock piece, so not the best plan to be on for Timeless in 2024, unfortunately. Up next is Rampaging Ferocidon, which is just like one of my personal favorite cards. I love jamming this card in other formats, but unfortunately it has the Archon of Emeria problem. Even though it does three different things, it is a 3/3 menace, players can't gain life, and it punishes them for making creatures. It dies to every removal spell in a format that is dominated by these hyper efficient 1 mana removal spells. So you are almost always going on a mana disadvantage when you go ahead and cast this. It's the same thing as Archon of Emeria. It's just it feels bad to play a 3-drop from your hand that doesn't do some sort of ETB or make up for value when it dies. Up next is Consigned to Memory. I put it in C tier. Maybe it's really a little lower than this, but I just want to open people's eyes to this card. This is a card that I've seen like once, and it was really good when I saw it the once, so people should consider it more. Counter target ability or counter target colorless spell. It's a triggered ability that it counters. So this is a really clean answer to things like Eldrazi, but it is also a way to counter the One Ring. There are a lot of use cases for this, and as replicates, so you can counter as many abilities as you want off of the stack. It's pretty sweet. I think that people should be looking at it. Next is Alpine Moon. Alpine Moon, not nearly as strong as Blood Moon, but this is Lurrus compatible, and if a card like Field of the Dead were to enter back into the meta, then you would want to jam this. Just right now, it's not in the meta. I don't think you should be playing this right now, but it is a very nice card to have access to in your Lurrus deck if there are problematic lands like Field of the Dead in the meta. Next is Teferi Time Raveler, and I was kind of not sure how to rate this guy. I had him in my notes as a card I wanted to rate. He's a bit more of a main deck card, but he is a really good hoser against things like Cascade, things like Amped Raptor, things where you're forced to cast a spell at instant speed, a card like Ephemerate that has Rebound. Teferi shuts all of that stuff off passively. I put him at C tier because I really wasn't sure how to rate him, because usually you main deck the Teferi instead of sideboarding him in. Oh, he's also incredible against any sort of counter magic. So if you're playing a combo deck, you could even play him as a counter magic prevention, but we have Defense Grid for that. That costs less mana, so maybe just play Defense Grid. Defense Grid is also colorless. You don't need to be blue and white to cast Defense Grid. I'm going to put my boy in C tier. He's a very strong card. It's just like as a sideboard card, are you going to sideboard in 3-mana Teferi? I don't know. As a main deck card, he's an S or an A. Like this is a fantastic main deck card in the deck that wants him. Up next, we have Norset. So in the context of being a sideboard card or even a main deck card, it's really F tier. Timeless format is a bit more powerful than it. Shutting off card draw from something like Brainstorm is fantastic. However, most non-blue decks do not get hit by this. Like I don't think like really any non-blue deck in the meta really gets hit by this. And even blue decks in the meta, like Show and Tell, they're leaning on dig through time for their card advantage a lot of the time, so it doesn't even get hit by this. So don't spend 3 mana and a sideboard slot on this card. Not the best idea. Up next is Virulent Plague. This is not something I've seen people jam, but it's something in old sideboards, so I just want to make people aware just in case the effect does become a good again. This is a way to hate on Field of the Dead tokens, or if there's just any sort of token deck that becomes a part of the meta, you can go ahead and slam this card. Realistically, deck doesn't exist that this is trying to hate on, but it is something that goes on the tier list because meta dependent, it could shoot all the way up to A tier. Up next is Chalice the Void. This card is not quite good. Chalice the Void does not cause timeless decks to fold in half the same way that modern decks do. If you think about the top meta decks, a lot of them are Lurrus decks that are heavily reliant on their 1s and 2s. However, those decks have a really even split of their 1s and 2s. So if you think about something like Energy or something like Dimir Lurrus, both of those decks, they would certainly suffer from a Chalice on 1, and a Chalice on 2 would be even worse against those decks. But Chalice on 2 costs 4 mana. That is quite tough, and in Timeless, there's really only one good way to get access to 2 mana on the play, and that is Ugin's Labyrinth. So theoretically, if you're on the play, you Ugin's Labyrinth, you imprint an Eldrazi, and then you cast this, yes, you are going to slow down the energy deck a lot, but if you're allowed to evaluate that card through that lens, let's do the reverse lens. You're on the draw, you don't have the Ugin's Labyrinth, your energy opponent goes turn 1 Ragavan, you don't have an answer to turn on Ragavan because you kept a Chalice hand. Ragavan hits you. They get a treasure. They then play Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride off of the 3 mana that they now have access to. And what's your Chalice on 1 going to do? So I would not recommend playing Chalice. If there was a combo deck that like Chalice on 0 hated on, I would like it. If there was a combo deck like a Storm deck that Chalice on 1 could really tax, then I would also like it. But it does not properly punch Lurrus decks in the gut the way that people think it does. It is pretty okay against mono black. Like if you do it on X=1 against mono black, it turns off their dark rituals, their thought seizes, their fatal pushes, removal spells, reanimates, etc. I think that's the one deck that it's okay against, but really you could just bring in a different sideboard card over Chalice. I don't recommend playing Chalice right now, but like I said, If we hit a meta where Chalice on 0 is good, put Chalice in your sideboard. But right now, don't do it. Up next, we have Aether Gust. This is something maybe could have been F tier, maybe could have been D tier, but it's something I want blue mages to be aware of. This is a way to interact with both permanents and spells on the stack, and it can interact with uncounterable permanents. So it's one of the ways to get around Cavern of Souls. This is the classic way to, when your opponent Caverns of Souls a Primeval Titan, you just Aether Gust it, and it's kind of funny. Um, it's not the best positioned in the current meta, but the fact that it can also answer permanents, so like it can put an Oko that's in play onto the top of its opponent's library. It could answer a Roiling Vortex that's in play if you're playing a combo deck. If your opponent escapes Uro out of the graveyard, you can just yank him off the stack and put him on top of the library. The fact that this card does all of these things means that blue mages should be aware of it at least, but the current meta, it might honestly be F tier instead of D tier. It's kind of between them. I just do think it is a strong and unique effect. All right, here is another version of Aether Gust, another red-green hate spell. This is one I saw in older sideboard cards, but unfortunately this is not the current technology you should be using. This is now a counterspell in mana drain format. There is no reason to ever play this card if you can play counterspell and mana drain. It's not that hard to support the double blue cost of those spells. That's not an argument. We're playing a fetch land format. I don't think anybody should be registering change the equation anymore, but I did see it in old sideboard, so I wanted to bring it up. Next is Yasharn, and this stupid pig has made me lose games. Not in Timeless, in other formats. And maybe a really long time ago in Timeless. But like this stupid pig is a really nice hate bear. The problem is he costs 4 mana. However, he draws 2 cards essentially when he enters the battlefield. He turns off fetch lands. He says F you to sacrifice decks. There's also just like a lot of cards in Timeless that incidentally cause you to pay life or sacrifice things as a cost. And it does passively hate on all of those. But at 4 mana, it's a tough ask. There's very few decks that can actually support this effect. But like it's a card with a lot of text on it that does hate on a large part of the Timeless metagame. So you can think about it. You can think about it. If you can support the stupid pig, you can play the big pig. Up next is Oko, my boy. Unfortunately, he is out of the meta right now. And the current like status quo creature decks, they just run him over. So energy just goes wide, absolutely runs him over. Demir Luris, it can easily Spiral Pierce him or have the answers to him and have the efficient threats like Psychic Frog to outvalue a blue-green based Oko deck, which is kind of wild. Unfortunately, my boy, he's not good. He's a very powerful card, so if the meta shifts, he can definitely go up. He's a bit more of a main deck card than a sideboard card, but I have seen worlds where people have had like 2 copies of Oko main, 2 copies side, same way that some people like to split their Swords of Plowshares and removal, 2 main, 2 side. Power Balance. This is one that I was kind of recommending to people like as soon as MH3 dropped. I saw this as like a Luris Mirror Breaker, and maybe there's something still there, so I'm going to put it in D tier, but like realistically, this is not like the best Mirror Breaker I've ever seen in my life. It's certainly interesting in Luris deck mirrors, where you have like a 33% chance to get a free spell every time your opponent casts something. That's pretty sweet, and it's definitely worth thinking about the card for that. There's powerful text on this card, but not meta right now. Rune Halo does not actually stop your opponents from winning the game in just about every single meta deck in Timeless right now. It is not good enough. It can give you protection from a Goblin Charbelcher, but the Charbelcher deck has a bunch of ways to go ahead and blow that up. If you want a sideboard card against Charbelcher, I would recommend something more generic like a Pithing Needle as opposed to a double white cost card. It does not stop you from losing to something like Approach of the Second Sun. Once upon a time, there were Tendrils of Agony decks that this would help against, but this is not a card that you should be playing in the current Timeless meta, and I don't really see there being a meta where this is a better pick than some of the other unfair deck sideboard cards that we had seen. Elish Norn, Mother of the Machines, this is going to go up in C tier, which is pretty high, for this list at least. This is the list of stinkers, if you haven't noticed. There's a lot of cards that are outdated tech here that people insist on jamming. But I think if you're playing the Beans deck, this is a really nice Beans Mirror Breaker. This passively hates on all of the enemy Beans activated abilities, triggered abilities, not activated abilities, triggered abilities when they enter the battlefield, which is kind of the point of the Beans deck. And it doubles up your own stuff, so if you're a Beans gamer, play this. You can afford 5 mana in your deck. You can always pitch this to a Solitude early in the game. The classic pitch to Solitude is now becoming pitches to Force for this format. I love it. All right, Torpor Orb, and this also will encompass all like the Torpor Orb creatures. I don't think these are great sideboard effects. Maybe I should have put it in D tier, or excuse me, F tier. But it's in D tier because it does technically have some sideboard utility. It does turn off some things, and metagame dependent, this might be a good call. I have seen people build their main decks around this effect too, where they like play Flage and Uro, and they try to just get a 3 mana 6/6. This by playing a Torpor Orb or playing the creature versions whose names are escaping me. Um, it's something. I don't think it's good though. All right, here's another F tier one. I've seen people like send me deck lists or post their deck list on Discord, and they have Harsh Mentor in it. And the reason they have Harsh Mentor in it is because they copied a deck from Modern. This is a Nadu sideboard card. You don't play this in Timeless. This is specifically for Nadu decks. Don't play this in Timeless. This has never been playable in the history of MTG Arena. However, it's on this tier list because if a Nadu deck or like some sort of activated ability combo deck does go to the top of the meta, this is a red way to answer that. And then we have another very similar card to Harsh Mentor that has a backside as well. Silence on the backside, a 2 mana 2/1 on the front side. Unfortunately, 2 mana 2/1s. I don't have the Dies of Cringe GIF here, but this is another Dies to Bowmaster situation. However, is this the worst, craziest thing that you could ever put in a Laris deck? Think so. Maybe there's a reason to play this, but in my opinion at least, if you are playing a Luris deck and you are playing against an unfair deck, you need to be turning your creatures sideways aggressively, and you should only be spending sideboard slots and only be spending mana on something that is going to definitely shut your opponent off. Casting Silence is only going to shut them off for one turn, and with that 2 mana I spent on Silence, I would much rather just cast another creature with my in my Luris deck and get a critical density of creatures in order to actually kill my opponent on the following turn. So I don't think Silence is a good plan for Luris decks, which is why that this card is an F tier. However, it is a unique effect. It is Harsh Mentor on the front, it is Silence on the back, and it can have that upside of pumping itself. So this is very much something that could be played. It's just currently F tier. And that's it. That is the final Hoser tier list. As you notice, there's a lot of cards that people try to get cute here, but they're really D and F tier. There's very few Hosers, or cards that I would classify as Hosers, that are very playable in the format right now. But of course, this can change based on meta. And that's going to be it for me. Oh my god, this is going to be like a 2 hour video, maybe longer. I'll see how much I can edit it down. This wacky video. So like bookmark this, share with your friends. I hope that this could be a resource for timeless players who are building their deck lists. Because this information does not exist all in one spot. There is no one place I can go and say, hello, I would like an artifact and enchantment, hate, sideboard piece, which cards are the best. That doesn't exist. But this is a video, so it's probably going to fall out of date in a couple of months. However, Timeless is a high power level format, so the meta rotates pretty slowly, especially after MH3. There's not going to be a set that shakes up the format like MH3 did for a very long time, unless Wizards of the Coast decides to do something like, okay, here's Timeless Masters, we've put a bunch of vintage cards into the format, which I don't think they're going to do that, but if they do that, it's new YouTube content for me, right? All right, thanks for watching, folks. If you actually stuck through to the end, you're crazy.